Good evening and welcome to the Hatfield School Committee, our January business meeting. It's Monday, January 13th. I'm Christy Boudreau, Chair of the Hatfield School Committee, and joined by administration and most of the committee this evening. Thank you for joining us. And we're going to start our evening with the opportunity to have public comment. So you can join us in person at Town Hall or via our Zoom link for public comment. Is there anyone with us that would like to speak this evening? Okay, thank you. And with that, I think we can actually end our Zoom link. And anyone who's watching via Zoom, we encourage you to use the Hatfield Community YouTube page, which is streaming live. And we'll move straight into Mission Moment. Anyone have any updates about how we're meeting and excelling in our mission?
I'd like to, if I can go,
Yeah.
I'd like to just highlight the, prior to our vacation, we had our Jolly Ball tournament, and we had 4th, 5th, and 6th grade come up to Smith Academy, and it was great. They had a wonderful time. They cheered the teams on. It was nice to see them fully engaged in that.
Awesome.
And to piggyback on that, we had in order to build community, we had a whole school pajama day. And one of the things that I was hoping to do more of was to get buddy classrooms to get together, but that just didn't work out. Teachers already kind of had something planned, but we are planning on doing something on that Friday before February vacation, something about sharing things with the community. Different grades are going to do something either for seniors or for the veterans, and do that with a buddy class. So
that's awesome. I was excited to see a lot of sort of stepped up communication, and I know that's like my heart warms by that, but both schools have a lot of stuff going out helping us just share more with the community about our schools and open houses that are coming up. So that's right on plan, and I know we'll hear more about that. I know it's in some of the updates. So did you want to say something?
I think I can do it during an update as well.
Oh, wherever you'd like to.
I have something. Although I did not go, the rest of my family went to the hockey game Saturday night, and I heard great things about it, how much fun it was, and all the friends that were there that, oh, I didn't know so-and-so was going, and we saw these people and those people, and it just was great that we had a section, and you never knew who was going to be there, and a couple of my kids were very surprised to see friends they haven't seen in a while, or but it seemed like everybody had a great time, and I thought that was awesome.
Another way we build community.
Yes.
That's wonderful. Anyone else want to share a mission moment? Okay. I'm tabling the consent agenda and the student report, and we're going to move straight on to field trip approvals. So Dr. Driscoll.
All right. Well, I'm going to hand it right over.
Going to make an introduction?
Yeah. Miss Mary Shanafelt is our senior class advisor, and would like to present a proposed field trip for the senior class. Yeah.
Why don't you sit where the microphone can catch you?
And as you go through, just let me know when you move slides, and I'll project your slideshow in just a second.
Hello, I'm Mary Shanafelt. I have been advising the current senior class for the last 4 years. Over the summer, I had some parents reach out asking about a senior class trip. They have known it has not typically been done at Smith Academy, but they were in hopes that maybe this could happen. And I proposed it to Dr. Driscoll, and he said that he thought it was a great idea and to pull through some ideas and go with the class. I polled the class on where they wanted to go, and their hopes, if it is approved, to go to a place called Ride and High Dude Ranch, which is in Warrensburg, New York, which is actually where I went on my senior class trip, and it was amazing and wonderful and fun. So I'm going to start out with the why a class trip slide. So a senior class trip offers students a unique opportunity to celebrate their final year of high school and create long-lasting memories with their classmates before they go their separate ways. It will be a well-deserved break after seniors finish their finals, which will conclude their high school careers. The location of this trip allows for students to be together and experience opportunities that are in areas of interest while remaining at the same location, and this will also limit bus trips. Students can participate in horseback riding, boating, swimming, beach volleyball, and lots of time to bond. So the proposed time to leave would be Friday, May 30th, which is the last day they would be taking their finals if they needed to make up any finals. So all finals would be completed, their high school career essentially minus graduation would be all done. And we would be returning on Sunday, June 1st, which would be right before graduation rehearsal starts. So it doesn't impact any graduation rehearsal or any of their classes. It's about a 2-hour and 40-minute trip up there. As the Willards are amazing people, they have talked to Michael's bus company, and they have so far tentatively secured us a bus, obviously, with waiting on approval from all of you. So I'm now on the there in the slide when and where. There's like a nice little map of the location we would be staying at. Students would be staying in a cabin. It can sleep up to 8 students per cabin, needing about only 3 cabins. I have already talked to 2, with the numbers of the class, we would need 1 female chaperone and 2 male chaperones, in which we have secured. So some activities that students can participate in is swimming. There's a pool, there's a lake. They can go boating. There's rowboats, pedal boats, paddle boats, kayaking. They can go fishing. There's some horseback ridings. There are barns there that they could horseback ride in. There's also the woods that have trails that they can go in, obviously, depending on their levels. And there's a bunch of sports, which our senior class is very hands-on in. And there's some beach volleyball, places to play basketball, a tennis court, and some places to play softball. And then underneath that slide, Connor, is just a little picture of all of the other activities that they can do while they're there. So lodging, they're going to stay in a cabin, like I said. Cabins can sleep 4 to 8 people. Downstairs, there's a bed with 1 queen and 2 twin beds. Upstairs, there are 2 rooms. There are 2 rooms downstairs. Both of them have 1 queen, 2 twins, and upstairs there's 2 rooms with 1 queen and 1 twin. There's also a pull-out couch. There are 2 full bathrooms, and each cabin will have a chaperone in there. I actually should have updated that. We only need 1 female chaperone, so that would be myself. I have secured 2 male chaperones, Mr. Richards and Mr. O'Connell. Underneath, there's just like a picture of the layout of what the cabin looked like and the layout of the upstairs and the downstairs where the students would be staying. Food is all included in the price of the class trip. So breakfast, lunch, and dinner are all provided cafeteria style at the ranch. The itinerary is right here. We would leave Smith Academy on Friday, May 30th around 12 p.m., arriving at Ride and High around 3, obviously giving some traffic, maybe a little bit later than that. And every day we'll be in the same location. The bus does not need to leave to travel any other location. We would all be in one location together where students can pick and choose what activities they want to do for the day. And then hopefully leaving on Sunday, well, obviously leaving on Sunday, June 1st, around 11 a.m. to head back home with a tentative 1 o'clock arrival, maybe stopping for lunch along the way. I did ask our class officers for some input because they could not be here tonight to help voice their hopes for a class trip. So this is from our secretary, Senior Caitlin Graves. She said, going on this class trip would be a great opportunity to strengthen our friendship as our time in high school comes to an end. It would be a fun way to end the years we spent together and create fun, long-lasting memories before we start our own adventures. For some of us, we are only used to seeing each other in school. This trip would allow us to get to know each other outside of school and bring us closer as friends, not just classmates. The cost for the trip would come out of the class funds. We've been fundraising a ton from freshman year all the way up till now. And I've talked to Riley and I've crunched the numbers, and tentatively per family, it would be between $300 and $400 in hopes that I can reduce that cost with a few more fundraisers I have in mind before the May trip. That's all I have. Any
Questions from the
questions?
committee?
So I just want to clarify one thing.
Yeah.
So it would be $300 to $400 per student after the reduction
Yes.
offsets. Okay.
Yes.
How many students?
I have 14 definites, 4 maybes, and 1 no right now. There's 19 kids total in the senior class.
Is the no because of other obligations or financial
Believes-
reasons or?
Because of other obligations. I asked the families if they're like, yes, no, yes, if cost was at play. It was for other obligations.
And we make sure that families know that if cost is a barrier, that we have resources to help with that.
When you showed the layout of the ranch, that one, I'm assuming there'll be other guests at the ranch while they are there. So
Yes.
our students will be in one area or mixed in with all the others.
We would be in one area with cabins right next to each other.
But like for the activities, there would be other people.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. For the activities, there'll be, yeah.
So this question is, you stated, and Dr. Driscoll stated that this is after their high school career is done and over. So kind of officially, when they're dismissed from school that Friday, their high school career is over, but it's still a school trip. So they still are under the
Absolutely.
same.
Yeah, and they have not graduated yet.
Yeah.
Haven't walked the stage.
Right.
So should
Their
there be
classwork is
something?
done.
But if there were shenanigans,
Yes.
I think, is that where you're?
Yes, that's where I was going. I want them to
There's-
have fun, but
But there is obviously repercussions in that graduation hasn't happened.
Correct.
Not that I'm expecting problems, not that you're expecting problems,
no.
but mindful of.
Yes, and back when I went on this trip in high school, they did a thorough bag inspection. Smelling shampoo bottles, looking at anything that you could think of. So
The
we
ranch
would-
did that or the
no,
chaperones?
the chaperones did that prior
So,
to leaving.
You'll be taking care of that.
Nothing's going to happen on my watch.
Given that this is a more like active trip than other trips, than like a trip to New York or DC, there's horseback riding and swimming. Is there any liability to the school if a kid gets injured while on a trip?
I don't believe so. I can check with our town council on that, but I think that would come into the liability of what we already have for field trips and also for the ranch itself.
Okay.
And when do you need to pull the trigger to make this work? Like, when do you need to? I'm anticipating we vote tonight, but at what point do we for sure need to say yes or no to this?
I'm penciled in at the ranch just to make sure. I said I still need to get it approved. So the sooner the better, just so that they have that date available for another school if they need it.
Okay. Do you want to hold up voting to check the insurance?
No, that's fine.
Okay, just checking.
I really love this idea.
Frankly, I mean, I'm happy for the seniors to go. I frankly like the sort of precedent of setting up something that they do because it gives the freshmen, sophomores, and juniors something to kind of aspire to.
And it fits with what we sort of, how we have shifted things with big field trips in the school too. So a couple of years ago when we went to DC, it was 8th through 11th grade because 12th grade had already been, but it allowed them to then have their own sort of own kind of thing. And so doing it this way, and then with 6th grade coming up, we have the opportunity to have, maybe a more extended middle school trip, and 9th through 11th grade trip, and then a senior trip as well, which I think could really benefit the students.
So I want to start by saying I love the idea. I really wanted to have a senior class trip and I didn't get one. So I really love the idea. No, No one's here's fault. I am taking just a second glance at our policies regarding field trips because the goal of our field trips is generally educational.
Mhm.
So I was just taking a double check. I looked previously, but we do have sort of in our policy information about non-academic field trips, and there would be no structured learning time that anyone would be missing. So I think that's all great.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay. And the finances seem really reasonable.
Yeah.
Which is good. So, is there a motion?
I'll make a motion to approve the senior class trip to the Ride High Ranch Resort as presented.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. So that's a 4-0 vote. Enjoy the trip. And on behalf of all of us, thank you for your service in working with students in this extra capacity, because those relationships mean a lot. And I know it's a lot of work. So thank you. Appreciate it.
And the consistency really helps on both ends.
Yeah.
So,
So we
Thank you.
appreciate it.
yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Do you have another trip you want to talk about?
Well, I can briefly talk about it, but I don't have the final itinerary yet. We are waiting to get pricing from Bubba Gump's restaurant, as well as there's a viewing, New York City viewing from the top of a skyscraper that we're waiting to get pricing on. But we're hoping to do a school-wide trip to New York City this year. We would go down, we would do Statue of Liberty, we'd do Ellis Island, the 9/11 Memorial, we'd see a Broadway show, and spend a little time at Times Square. And then it would be a 2-day trip.
That's a lot to pack in
It's a
2
lot
days.
to pack in 2 days. It
Wow.
would be a very full itinerary. But we have the same group that has done our DC tours in the past. They do this tour as well. We can't get tickets to see Wicked, but thinking the show that there's a show called Juliet, which seems to be pretty good and appropriate for our age levels. So yeah, I think it would be a great chance for students to experience New York City.
What's the timeline look like? When?
April or early April. I think April 8th, 8th and 9th.
So timeline is ticking away there.
Yeah. So we expect to have the finalized itinerary and pricing by the end of the week, so we
Okay.
can get interest, and then we can figure out how many buses we need, hotel rooms, that kind of.
As a short window for families who may have a financial obligation to participate.
It is. Yep.
Okay.
Does the funding for the school? Sorry, I cut you off. Does the funding for the school trip come from the school's budget at all, or is it just all funded from individual?
We don't have a line for field trips. Well, we do have a line, but it doesn't have any money in it.
We have an aspiration line in the budget.
But we do have the fund for students if it would be a challenge to pay for it. And the reason it would have to be in that particular timeline is it's sort of that happy early season area for baseball where they've had 2 weeks of practice, which is great because then they can play games, but nothing's scheduled there. It's right before the games really start.
And it wouldn't interfere with the musical or anything like that?
No, it shouldn't interfere with the musical. In fact, it should inspire the musical.
We can only
More.
hope.
Well, hopefully by the 8th and 9th of April, we have a cast and everybody in place.
Yeah, there's a meeting tomorrow.
Run lines on the bus.
8th and 9th is a Tuesday, Wednesday.
Then it's not the 8th and 9th. It would be that Friday, I believe. Thursday, Friday.
Of that week?
4 and 5 or 11 and 12?
Well, Thursday the 10th, Friday the 11th.
Yes.
All right.
We don't meet again until the 10th of February. So this may need to come back in the meantime. I'm sure the committee could make a virtual meeting if needed. It feels like giving
Yeah.
families more time
Yeah.
with information.
And we can also, as I put it out there, I could say, here's the cost. Let us know if you're interested. We anticipate approval on a certain date.
Well,
Um,
I would be willing to put forward a motion for initial approval. So you can move forward with finishing your fundraising and everything else, and then we could just do a final approval. I mean, we've done it before. We don't have to, but like we could.
Is there a second?
Sure, I'll second that.
Okay. So do we want to have, what's the difference between an
I feel like
initial
if
and
we
a
approve it
final?
initially, I don't feel like we need to schedule some like last minute meeting to get the final approval through. Do it at our next meeting
So,
in February.
yeah, I'm just trying to make sure Connor can move forward before February 10th, because I think they're going to need to make plans before, I'm
Yeah.
assuming. Is there any hesitation?
We have a pretty good idea of the itinerary and what,
Yeah.
I can't see anything that would cause us to go.
I
off
know,
the rails.
I don't
Right.
want to be in a position of having to say no to anything after giving initial approval.
Hmm.
Like, I don't know,
Like about the money or
cost or,
So let's talk very quickly here. What are the things that would inspire a no vote for this field trip? Is there a game stopper that are there things we have said no to previously for field trips? We didn't have enough
this is the
chaperones
first
because we didn't have
overnight for
whole
a group
school.
this size, the whole school. The whole school trip last year was a day trip,
I thought we did it at Washington DC.
We did, it was
DC.
8th through 11th grade. Yeah.
but it was a small group. It wasn't that large.
Yes.
Um,
And we don't know what the group size would look like for this
Right.
either. I mean, we don't know if it would be the whole school. It might be that we have half the school that's interested in going.
Are there other? I'm not aware of any other trips planned for other groups except for the band.
The
So the
band,
band has a trip, but there's no Spanish trip
not this year.
this
No,
year.
and when is the band trip?
band trip is in May.
And there's a cost associated with that as well. And it's possible that families will have to face funding these two trips. If their band member wants to go
Yeah, it
on
is possible.
both.
Yep.
Well, I won't hold it up. I'll
I
be
don't
looking for a
feel-
lot more details.
Yeah.
You know,
I guess from my perspective, I'm wondering what, Christy was just saying, like, so that the school can move forward with things. Well,
and particularly if they know what the committee is concerned about, they can be mindful of that in these
right.
last
I wouldn't want it to be
stages.
like
I think we
exorbitantly
can-
expensive.
I think we can
Yeah.
do
You know.
that without an actual vote. We can have a consensus of move forward with the planning of this,
Yeah.
and we can vote on it.
Doesn't matter to me.
We have a motion and a second on just formality's sake. So we're going to either take the vote or it can be removed. Do you?
I forgot that. It's been a long
So,
day.
yes.
Um,
So not to get mired in Robert's Rules of Order.
yeah.
I hear Kathy's point about not wanting to pull it back.
Mhm.
I'm not seeing any signs of big hesitations not to do it.
And I also feel like if what you need is just like move forward, see how many students want it, get the cost better, like
Go and do that. and
please, initially,
then-
we approve that.
so
Yeah.
I think go forward.
Right.
My
quickly.
concerns are about the accommodations, adequate chaperones.
Yep.
You know,
We would look to have a 10-to-1 chaperone, student to chaperone ratio to break into groups that were grade level based. When it came to rooms, we would try to have students in the same grades rooming with each other and blocks of rooms separated by chaperones. So adjoining rooms you couldn't have girls going to boys' rooms, that kind of thing.
potentially, could the middle schoolers have a lower ratio than 10-1?
Potentially, yep. Yeah.
I'm just thinking that they might need a little extra.
Yeah.
I trust the older students of middle schoolers are still excitable and
They sure are.
and given the eclipse
Mhm.
trip, I just think having maybe a couple extra eyes on the middle schoolers, if that's something that
Yeah, we could
is
absolutely do
possible.
that. Yep.
But that's where my concerns lie.
Sure.
Okay. I'm going to ask to table this vote, and that way I think you got what you needed, which is what you were looking for. So
It's like literally doesn't matter. It's fine.
and we will move on and look forward to hearing about that for final firm approval in February, but I don't see any reason not to move forward.
Great. Thank you.
And with that, we will turn our attention to student services and our presentation for this evening.
So I'm going to apologize right off the start for the length of my presentation tonight. I've got quite a few slides to cover, but I do want to kind of like establish where I'm going before we get into the presentation. So back in the 1960s, under the Johnson administration, President Johnson actually presented the Early Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And some of the themes of that act actually focus on segregation of kids in school. Now, what a lot of people don't understand is that President Johnson at one point had been a middle school teacher, and he was addressing some of the segregation that he saw in the state of Texas relevant to families that weren't English speaking. And over the years, the educational system, whether it's been through the efforts in Massachusetts to first develop special education law, which special education law in Massachusetts preceded federal law by a couple of years. And the people that crafted special education law at the federal level were responsible for actually crafting the Massachusetts laws back in the early to mid 1970s. So at that time, special education in the state of Massachusetts included folks like kids that were pregnant, or ELL students were all considered special ed kids. So in Boston, you had over 10,000 individuals that actually were receiving special education services without actually having any kind of special ed guidance or laws to let them know what the process should be. So by 1975, we had our first federal special education laws, and those eventually morphed into what is known as IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And that act continues on today. It is also reinforced by things like, over the years, No Child Left Behind. In 2001, it was reinforced again by the President's Commission on Excellence in Special Education. Again, all laws that kind of stress the idea that we need to really be mindful of segregation in education. So we've had more of a push in the last 24 years relevant to inclusion, whereas special ed services, the foundations of them at one time had been more of a resource room model. We don't really hear resource room models actually being talked about much anymore, but the old resource room model actually took the place of general curriculum instead of supplementing it. So nowadays we do have still IDEA that guides us, and we've just recently gone through TFM, which I know I'll be giving a report on later on tonight. But to go into the PowerPoint, let's actually talk about slide number 2. So I did a program evaluation, or started the bones of that back over the summer. And one of the things I found was that taking out developmental disabilities as a category, and we do have multiple categories that we find students eligible under. These are the main ones, but there are also things like communication, health, neurological disabilities that can be added to that, as well as deaf and blindness disabilities. So when I've looked at our total numbers, and again, taking out developmental delays is really, I hate to describe it as a catch-all, but it is a catch-all for kids up to age 9. It's essentially one of those categories that's applied there because maybe we don't know if it's a neurological or a specific communication disorder or even an intellectual disorder. So it is kind of a safety net category for kids under 9 years old. So I leave it out because I know it's a large category. I know it also doesn't clearly define always what we're looking at with our major categories. So the ones that are listed on page 2 of the presentation are the main categories: specific learning disabilities. And specific learning disabilities is really kind of the main focus in most states, most school districts, because it includes several different categories. But the two primary ones are math disability and a reading disability. And reading disabilities in the United States are really kind of like the top dog when it comes to sheer numbers alone. Our other categories are autism, which over the last 25 years, when we talk about ratios, we see the ratios relevant to autism. I think when I started in education, the ratios were somewhere around 1 in 150, and they've like decreased. Well, basically the ratios have gotten much tighter over the last 25 years. So autism, with no surprise, is our second biggest category. Communication, our third, and emotional, our third category. I want to talk about some of the key mechanisms of the IEP. When we look at the IEP, there's certain things that we always have to be very mindful of because they are specific to the student. So that's why it's called an individual education program, because they are backed by federal laws. IDEA backs the IEP, and Americans with Disability laws actually back the 504 process. Now, the difference between those two documents is that 504 is really a document that focuses on access to the curriculum. How does the disability actually affect a major life function of the individual? Where the IEP really focuses on modification and specialized instruction. So there is quite a bit of difference there. And over the years, people have been kind of confused by those definitions. And even the IEP can confuse that at times as well, because what we used to refer to as the PLEP A and PLEP B were all focused on accommodations, so access to the curriculum. So for a long time, people thought that a 504 and an IEP could exist at the same time, and that's not the case. You can have a 504 plan that just specifically addresses access to the curriculum, but still have that information included in the IEP as well. Some of the key components are also the team vision, what we're actually looking to accomplish during the cycle of the IEP that meets the individual needs of the student. We set goals, and we also in the IEP document, set a service delivery grid to talk about who and when and for how long and what goals the services are going to be connected to. So most of this is actually done during the team process. We get together on a yearly basis after a child is found to be eligible, and we review the IEP and make updates. And every 3 years, we go through a reevaluation process to make sure that we're on track, relevant to the students' goals. We actually focus on, I'll point this out very specifically. Item number 3 gets lost a lot in the eligibility process. Our goal is to set up supports for a student so that they can make effective progress and or access the general curriculum. Now, a lot of times that gets lost in the discussions. And what I do find in a lot of the districts that I've worked in, that the mindset is often a child needs support, they need to be on a one-to-one or an IEP. And that can be really kind of like a closed argument. It's not necessarily that the student needs support. They can receive supports through other methods, whether it's Title I services or accommodation plans or possibly 504 plans. But the IEP is specific in that we're providing those modifications, specialized instruction that actually helps the student to progress and to access the general curriculum. If we don't actually have specialized instruction in place, we don't have a 504 plan. And I do see that some of the trends that we've had in this district is that when we talk about modifications and specialized instruction in our teams, that is sometimes where the discussions break down. And I do have to say we've had some kind of like hearty discussions relevant to how modifications are actually provided and how that actually meets eligibility services. And I am pushing staff to really kind of like answer those questions and to come prepared to meetings where they're not just saying the student's eligible, but the student's eligible because they require these modifications or specialized instructions. Yes.
I'm going to try not to interrupt you
That's okay.
often at all, but on occasion, if we don't ask it now, it's going to be really hard to come back.
Yep.
And what I'm willing to interrupt for is clarification on stuff. So could you give an example, particularly for committee members who maybe haven't been through the process and or families who are at home trying to understand, can you give some explanations or examples of what is different between modification to curriculum versus the access to curriculum? Like, that's not jargony for you.
Mhm.
It's kind of jargony for us.
Sure.
Can you give us some examples that make that a little more tangible?
Sure. So modification could be is simply looking at where the student is. And this is a point that I don't want to spend a lot of time as far as my description. When we look at goals, goals can be written under two different umbrellas. One is a growth goal. So a year's worth of IEP services should equal a year's worth of growth grade-wise. And a lot of people write goals that way. The problem with that is that it doesn't necessarily align with the standard. So if I say that a student has a third grade reading level, and I'm expecting a year's worth of growth in that IEP period, that sounds great unless the student's a 10th grader. They're never going to meet standards if they're in 10th grade with a third grade reading level. So our job is to take the 10th grade curriculum and modify it as much as possible to actually allow or help the student to access the curriculum. So if we have to do something like we're reading, let's say Moby Dick in 10th grade, maybe somebody in a special ed program, let's say the student has a reading disability and they get services in their ELA classroom, either from a teacher or an ESP. But they also have a secret service, and this will play into some of the things I'll talk about a little later. But the secret service is more of a pullout. And secret service, again, should supplement what's going on in the general ed classroom, not take over for it. And we do see that sometimes here in the district, that we do see a secret service on a very small scale take over for what goes on in the general ed curriculum instead of supplementing it in some way. So if I'm reading Moby Dick, my secret service with a special ed teacher might be to review vocabulary, because usually reading goals, they might be comprehension based, they might be decoding, they might be phonological, they might even include written language and how it's impacted. So if I'm working with a student in a secret service, I'm going to go through the vocabulary that they don't understand before the student actually gets to that text in the classroom. So if they're doing a read aloud in the classroom, or they actually do kind of like role playing, or basically break down the story into characters and share characters and read aloud in the classroom, then the student's actually seeing that stuff ahead of time. And so it's kind of pre-taught. So they have a better chance of actually moving along with the classroom as an integrated member of the classroom. But also they review as well, so they can look back at what did you have struggles with in the previous classroom? What were the barriers to learning? Let's talk about some of those things. And maybe some of that time in secret services is also presenting the material in different ways. As a school psychologist, I used to make recommendations relevant to reading based off of if the student had strong memory or visual skills. You take Moby Dick and how many renditions there are of the book into movies, play the first 15 minutes of it so the student can visualize the characters and the settings and maybe get used to some of the vocabulary by hearing it from somebody else. So that's more than an access, because you're doing it with a teacher who's actually going over the vocabulary with you, looking at your learning strengths and actually trying to play the information to those strengths, and understanding if you've got difficulties with things like memory skills, like short-term memory skills, that possibly you're using things like character maps or some sort of graphic organizer to help you visualize the information to refer back to. So some of it can be kind of like backing up a bit and saying, okay, your skills aren't here yet, but we can prep you for this standard-based goal writing. that is in alignment with what the general ed curriculum is doing, instead of looking at where you are testing or assessment wise and only staying at that level. So really, if it's done well, we should be challenging students that are on IEPs with the same curriculum that their typical peers get, but we do it in a way that offers them support and maybe does back up a little bit sometimes relevant to their skills, but make sure that we're trying to create kind of like a level playing field. And that might be with the presentation of instruction, how we actually expect students to respond to things, whether it's like a test or giving them wait time in a classroom, or maybe giving them something almost like a sentence starter to help them kind of like answer a question. It could be things like giving them more of an opportunity to describe answers on a test. And also kind of like the setting itself. Do they do better when they're actually working in a small group or individually? We try to provide those supports to them in the general ed setting, but always with the chance to, if they're working together as a full classroom, and if they break apart into groups, do they have the ability to actually reintegrate? Now, sometimes, like inclusion models, I talked about this being a bigger issue since like 2001. Inclusion is not always handled in a way that actually promotes kids that are on IEPs reintegrating with their class. So sometimes you can go into a classroom, you might see a bunch of kids on IEPs that are working with a special ed teacher or support staff in the back of the room, but they're working on something completely different. So if there's an opportunity to reintegrate with the class, it's probably not going to be there because they're not all working on the same material, even though the teacher that's working with the special ed students is heavily modifying the curriculum. So in those cases, really the only thing that's missing is a fifth wall, and you end up with kids that are basically being segregated inside the general ed classroom and not really being given that chance to mix. So when I see things like reading groups going on, I'm not saying this happens here, I'm saying from experience, I've gone into special ed classrooms, I've gone into general ed classrooms, and in the general ed classroom, sometimes I see like a reading group or a reading circle taking place, but there's a group of kids that are all on IEPs working in the back of the room on something else, sometimes not even with the same like materials. If the general ed kids are working with a particular text or story, sometimes the special ed kids aren't working on that same story at all. So the chance of reintegration is really, quite slight. Yes.
I need a little more clarification. So what you described was specialized instruction modifying the curriculum.
Yes.
So can you give me an example then of what accommodation access would be?
So the 504. So
Well, just because you had asked like the
Right, I
difference
was
between
trying to-
those two.
Yeah,
Right.
real simple example would be somebody with a urinary tract infection that needs to actually go down to the nurse's office to access the bathroom and check in with the nurse. That would be you go outside the building and look at the sidewalk.
Mhm.
Those cuts into the sidewalk and the curb are actually part of ADA. So it's basically literally, physically, it can be access to the building or access to a support. So if I have like a visual disability of some sort and I'm technically legally blind, my access might be something like using a computer that actually increases the size of font. I don't really need specialized instruction. I just need something that allows
So
me
you
to
can
access.
still use the general education curriculum, but you're going to need some kind of service that will help you
Yeah.
be able to experience the general ed
Yeah.
curriculum, but no additional instruction or
Right.
no specialized instruction.
Right.
Okay.
Even somebody with a hearing disability, you might have somebody with an Oticon or a phonak that the person has hearing aids, but they actually have shoes, and the teacher has a transmitter device,
Right.
and the shoes on the hearing aids are actually receivers. It actually allows that student to actually hear better than even if the teacher was standing 3 or 4 feet away. A lot of times, kids with hearing disabilities, even that close, without some sort of like boost to their hearing system, it still comes off as being muffled or hard to understand.
Okay.
Yeah.
So today we were talking about the IEP, or at least on
We
this
are.
slide. We're talking about the IEP, which includes access and modification.
And part of the reason that I'm mentioning the 504 is because, again, it gets back to that
It's
mindset.
confusing.
It is,
Yeah.
but again, it's like, does the student need help? Yes. Well, the next question should be access or modifications. And a lot of people will say yes and think that that is immediately the Willy Wonka golden ticket to the IEP. And it really isn't, because if you've got a poorly written IEP, you really don't have anything much better than a badly written 504 plan at that point. And people kind of like lose sight of that. So pushing staff to actually come to meetings, to really be prepared to talk about specialized instruction and modification is key into really kind of like having the foundation for a well-written IEP.
May I ask one more question
Please.
really
Sure.
quick? I am so sorry. Were you saying secret services?
Seagrid.
Okay, I was like, I'm sure it's not that, but I could not hear anything but secret services. And I thought if I heard it, I don't know who at home is thinking that we're offering secret services.
No,
to our
I heard it
students.
too, but I knew what it
Thankfully,
was.
it's also on the screen.
Okay,
Yes.
So-
I just wanted to like,
No, it's a good.
I heard the
Good.
same thing.
okay,
Yeah.
thank you. I was
Let
like,
me
please
actually-
tell me we're not
Let me
giving.
clarify that a little bit. On the third slide at the bottom of it is actually, so we have our goals
Mhm.
and those service delivery points, A, B, and C grid. A grid is consultation, usually between a special ed teacher and possibly another teacher, general ed
Mhm.
teacher. It could be related services and a general ed teacher. It could also be something like special ed teacher to the parent. The B grid services are actually push-in services, what we do in the general ed setting. And the C grid is always pull-out services. It could be specialized classrooms like our STAR program. It could be related services like individuals or small group, or it could be the academic focused areas that.
And they're all written out and they're not secret whatsoever.
Well,
Everybody knows what
They're
they are.
confidential to that family.
They're confidential to
perhaps.
the
There you go.
family, however.
So slide 4, I just mentioned, and I know we talked about federal IDEA. It's also state regulations under 603 CMR 28.0 to 28.10. And this is kind of a cradle to grave regulations on the state level relevant to eligibility, holding meetings, determining eligibility, and basically implementing the IEP. So my analysis on slide 5, what that consisted of was really going through every individual IEP that was active at the time that I started working on this. This took me a little over a month to actually go through the full IEPs. And now I wasn't reading the full IEP from cover to back, but I was focused on several different areas that I thought were very important. Now, primarily one of the things that when I do this, it's not just for the sake of doing a program evaluation, but it's also to kind of help me prep for the budget season. If I need to ask for services, me breaking down some of the services that I can see in the IEP are going to be helpful. So for purposes moving forward with this, what I focused on were specific learning disabilities in really math and reading, because those are the things that we find the most. We do find emotional supports in the IEP. We definitely find communication supports in the IEP, and we definitely find autism supports in the IEP as well. Most of those services are handled either by special ed teachers or related service providers or specialized classrooms. So again, the big categories for us though are math and reading under the specific learning disability category. So I'm looking at the goal, how the goal is written. I'm looking at the connection to the service delivery grid, and I'm trying to hammer out what that looks like relevant to man hours and also services to see where our primary categories are. So I'm really kind of like focused on B and C grid supports and how those actually play out overall. So if I look at slide 6, I'm going to say some of the trends that I found, and these were trends where they weren't huge trends, but the numbers were definitely over like 10 cases throughout the district. And some of these are okay. The first one is not okay. When we look at our numbers, I know in the presentation I talk about how many percentage of students that we have on IEPs during the time that I collected this information. So we had around 107 students. And looking at SIMS data from the last SIMS report at the time before I came on board, we had, I think, around 322 students that were listed in the data. So I came up with essentially over 33% of kids actually on IEPs in the district. That's just IEPs. It's not counting 504s or any accommodation plans or anything else. That's a really high number. Pre-pandemic, most districts would be like in the high teens. Post-pandemic, districts definitely climb, but usually between 22 to 25. Going back to last year's SIMS data, I found that at one point your low was 28.2. So I'm kind of hoping that some of the things that we are trying to do right now lowers that number a bit, because my concern is that we're over-identifying, because we're not really identifying clearly if a student needs a modification. So I'll use the first listing on page 6 as my example of a concern. Related services only. We have 17 students that either receive services in speech or OT, and that's it. No specialized instruction, no modification. And this isn't a new problem. This has been going on for years, but people think that a related service only equals access to an IEP. It does not. Dennis Driscoll, back in November of 1998, actually came out with a memorandum. He stressed that if you've got an IEP that's written without specialized instruction, you're not really talking about IEP services. And that's sometimes hard for folks to actually grapple with. And even the other day, last week, I ran into a retired special ed director that challenged me on whether that was true or not. Now, being on the books for over 25 years, you'd like to think that more people would know about it. But the fact is that related service providers can provide services under a 504 plan, because the 504 plan doesn't require modifications. It doesn't require specialized instruction. And districts that I have worked in do actually do that. So it's not like a new practice. It's not something that we need to kind of like clarify with DESE. Districts do it as a regular practice all the time. So if I took 17 kids off of IEPs and put them onto 504, the services wouldn't actually change under the 504. They'd receive the exact kind of services. But often, and I will say, parents get nervous about, ooh, 504, it doesn't carry the same weight. Remember, I said that both of them are backed by federal law. And people get into the belief that the 504 can't be as involved as the IEP. The 504 allows really any kind of structure that we want to place into it. So if the parents want to get together like every couple of months to review the 504 and the progress, and they're looking for like a service delivery like structure in the 504, those things are fine. They can do progress reporting as often as we do in special ed, and even more so if that's needed. So there's really no kind of like limit to that, but people have gotten into this idea that the IEP is something special over other types of plans that exist out there. That's not necessarily true.
So I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
So students with a 504, it's still managed through student services. They still get a plan. It's all drawn up and all spelled out exactly what they are entitled to. Is there a difference in reimbursement from governing authorities for a 504 versus an IEP?
Yeah.
And might that be one of the reasons why we've
What is
pushed
the
people towards
difference?
IEPs?
What is the difference in reimbursement?
Things like circuit breaker don't actually fall into the same category for a 504. So circuit breaker, when I'm filling out like things like school choice increment, or which is also, I'm not going to say it's the same form. It is the same form, or it has been up until recently. So school choice increment and circuit breaker forms were basically carbon copies of each other. Circuit breaker is specific to special ed only. So I can't put 504 students into reimbursement.
So is there reimbursement for 504 services?
No, not under circuit breaker. Under school choice, there could be.
So school choice students, we would see reimbursement, but we wouldn't see state or federal dollars coming in. Circuit breakers.
Right, not for circuit breaker. So circuit breaker, and there is kind of a catch here as well, because most kids, we only have a few kids that go out of district for placement. So the circuit breaker formula for us to get money back is essentially 4 times the foundation amount that we get for a special ed student. So what I want to qualify that is we don't get any reimbursement back until we spend probably close to $50,000 on like tuitions. Anything over $50,000. So let's say just a round number. We spend $100,000 on tuition and we seek circuit breaker reimbursement. The first $50,000, we get nothing back. The other $50,000 will get up to 75% if the state approves the 75% amount every year. So essentially, we would get back like $750,000 of $50,000. So, but that's only IEPs. It doesn't count for 504s at all.
So if the services that we're providing don't change, depending on whether it's written up as an IEP or a 504, what is the driving interest to recategorize them?
In my mind, we're getting into a bad practice of just putting kids on IEPs that don't have specialized instruction or modifications. It's I'm not sure a good way to describe it. It's like if we're trying to teach a child the right way to doing things, except we keep on reinforcing the wrong way of doing it, at some point they're going to determine that that's kind of like the way to do it. I would kind of like translate that into like our staff and saying, again, if staff come to a meeting and they say, my opinion is that the student needs to be on an IEP, and we don't push that it's supposed to be for specialized instruction, modification, accessing the curriculum and making progress, then we get into that state where we kind of are right now, where people say, well, it's my opinion and that should be good enough.
The way you're describing it, it sounds like there's a financial disincentive to recategorizing them as a 504 instead of an IEP.
So, and the state also recognizes that because circuit breaker initially was supposed to be 100% reimbursement. And the reason it's not is because they were afraid that districts would actually take advantage of that and categorize kids too much into categories where they would get a higher rate of reimbursement.
Does the state audit or punish people who are categorized as an IEP when they should be a 504?
No.
So recategorizing them only changes our reimbursement
Yes.
and has us do it the right way.
Yes. And I'm also going to stress one of the cons of this is that if we're putting kids on IEPs that don't need to be on IEPs, two things. We're increasing the caseload of our teaching staff.
That's the part I want to understand. So please speak to that.
And we're also taking services away from kids that might need them because we're over identifying.
But if they would still need the same services on a 504 plan.
But again, we're not talking about a special ed teacher. We're
So
talking
it's
about
just
a
the
related
special
service
education
provider.
teacher.
Right.
Who may or may not be providing any services to that student.
They'll still have to write the IEP because they are the liaison for that student. So any kind of like progress reporting that isn't provided by a related service provider, you would expect the special ed teacher to do the progress reporting. So they may not even do progress reporting, but they are writing the IEP.
So that is, from a financial standpoint, that is the crux, is that we're staffing for the reporting progress, which is labor intensive if we keep them on IEPs. And that has a real financial issue
Connor.
attached.
And am I correct in saying too that there's a requirement for a special ed teacher to be present at an IEP meeting?
Yes. Yep.
And so when those happen for students who don't necessarily or wouldn't necessarily qualify for an IEP over a 504, but when the special ed teachers are pulled from their instruction duties, that can have the impact of not providing the instruction during those times, right? Correct?
So if we continue to have 504s written up as IEPs, it's a staffing issue that will come back and impact.
It already is.
I understand. Okay.
So a couple of the things I'll just mention on page 6, and these are not necessarily negatives at all. Students receiving like social emotional learning or counseling supports in IEPs, we had 40 at the time of the data analysis. And students needing support with executive functioning skills, This sometimes is how you take in visual information or utilize information, whether it's visually, whether you're reading it or manipulating it, and how well you can actually organize the information and use it. We had 31 students actually receiving executive functioning, organizational skills support in IEPs.
And so is the issue that it shouldn't be there, or is the issue is it's
I'm
there
just-
alone?
no,
Or
I'm
is
ju-
this just a,
Actually, I'm
this
just
is the
mentioning it
trend?
because it's a trend that I
Okay.
see. It's not
I
a
was
bad
just checking to
trend.
see if those all three were like of a kind, but you're saying.
No, they're not.
Okay, just checking.
So slide 7, just looking at some of the trends with C versus B grid services. There's a small table down the lower left-hand side of that slide. You can see that B grid services, and I broke it down, no particular reason why I broke elementary down into 2 groups. I will say that pre-K and K, even though they're included, really B and C grid services aren't really like a focus of the IEPs that significantly. And you find kids that have goals for things like readiness skills, not necessarily going to be SLD-based goals. Those are kids that are going to be clearly identified, usually as developmental delay, unless there's something specific that's linked to a diagnosis. So I do include pre-K and K, but again, the numbers in those 2 grade levels are very slight. So if I'm looking at B grid services, push-in services, I see that we had essentially 107 different entries for B grid services. And when I look at C grid services, I'm looking at 168 different C grid services for students. Now I will, as we get into like slide 8 and some of the following slides, I'm going to break down that data a little more to show you what some of the impact of that is.
Can we back up just 1 second? I'm sorry.
Sure. Yep.
168 kids with pullout services.
Not kids.
Or, I'm sorry, students.
Items.
It could be the same kid has multiple pullouts.
Thank you.
Yes. So that's one thing I want to kind of like show you on slide 8. It's kind of a comparison, but more or less a comparison between B and C grid services for particular subjects and age groups. So the left-hand side of the slide, blue services are all B grid services, and red is all C grid services, and this is all elementary school. Whereas the right-hand part of the slide, yellow is B grid services, and all the purple parts of the graph are C grid supports. Now,
What is ACAD?
academic. So that's one of the trends that I want to talk about here, is there is an over-reliance on academic supports. This makes it very hard for me to look at IEPs and determine where staff are, because academic support is used as kind of a catch-all. Now, what I expect to see in an IEP is, like, let's say, just for an example, I've got a student with a math disability. I see a B grid math service. It might be something like 5 times 30, 5 times 45, meaning that 5 times a week in a 5-day cycle, a special ed teacher or an ESP will go into the math class in general education and offer support to the student as a group of students for 30 minutes, possibly 45 minutes. They might be there for the entire class or only part of it. And then I would expect to see the possibility of a C grid service. The C grid service should probably be something like possibly 5 times 30 or 3 times 30, depending on what the student needs, or I might not see a C grid service at all for math. So what I expect to see is a number of math goals and a number of C grid goals that are probably equal to or lower than the number of B grid services. But when I start seeing C grid services that are higher than how many math goals that we actually have, it means that we're pulling the student out more than probably once a day, or it might not even be every day, like twice a day, but it might be multiple times more than 5 during the week. So that starts to raise a red flag for me, relevant to over-identifying how many times we're pulling a student out of their general ed curriculum to receive additional supports in math when we're going into the general ed classroom already, and then providing a tiered level of support with C grid services that just doesn't explain to me why we're spending more time outside of the general curriculum providing more math supports than what the actual class runs at. So the academic support piece is on top of that. And when it's not broken down, I can't read the academic support entry in the service delivery grid and tell you. So here's part of the problem with this is in the service delivery grid, we link our service to the goals or a goal. So oftentimes with an academic support, it may say something like, this support is linked to goals 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. That might be executive functioning, it might be math, it might be reading, it might be decoding, phonological awareness, comprehension. But there's nothing in the frequency and duration of that that tells me how many minutes is devoted to each one of those subjects. So I can't pinpoint where my staff is or how much time they're actually spending on these academic supports. And it makes it very hard to actually break down sometimes what I'm actually looking at relevant to staff and staff coverage. So some of what I'm also referring to here, and I think, Adam, this kind of like speaks to your question earlier, is there is an overlap. And we look at the service delivery grid and we look at ESPED, we identify, are we providing the service in like an individual session or a small group or to a larger group? Generally, classrooms are going to be larger groups. Small group and individuals are going to be like the consultation and the pullout services in the C grid. So we might, if I'm looking at pullout services in the C grid, I could be looking at a special ed teacher working with anywhere between, in a small group, 2 to 8 students. If I put a paraprofessional in that C grid services, that could be anywhere between 2 and 12 students. So some of the numbers that we're going to get into in a little bit, I'm going to show you like total hours that we're actually spending, but just realize that we're also talking about sometimes anywhere between 2 and 12 kids that could be together in a small group. So the next couple of slides are just kind of like breaking down the information from the first group, talking about B grid so that you can see that between elementary and secondary levels, that the numbers that we actually see between like the elementary schools and the elementary school and the secondary school, how those numbers actually play out relevant to B grid math, B grid ELA, and then academic supports. And then slide 10 is really looking at the C grid and seeing how those numbers actually break down again in those categories: C grid math, C grid ELA, and C grid academic support.
So I'm guessing that as you review this, I just want to sort of relook at this, and I think I speak for all of us. It's sort of like I guess that's what we should expect. I really would like your take on, as you look at these grids, if this is what we have, is there anything here that is a red flag to you? I mean,
yes.
so
So those higher numbers in C grid services.
it's the B to C comparison that feels inverted, is what I am
It
taking
does.
away.
And that's one of the things I'm saying in the slides is that we have an over-reliance on C grid supports. And some of them, like the academic support entries, are vague. That is not new for districts. It is a problem for administrators in trying to analyze where we're actually spending our time and where our staff is utilized. I could break it down further. It would probably take me a couple of weeks of just trying to go through schedules or getting the schedules and going through minute by minute where staff are to actually make sense out of it so that I could analyze it better. I shouldn't have to do that, but
That's
that
certainly
would
not
be
where
what it
my
would take.
questions lie, so
That's
I
okay.
don't know if somebody else is seeking that. Okay.
Can I ask a question before we
Sure.
move on?
Sure.
The elementary C grid for ELA, could that be so high because of the reading specialist type things that are happening?
So there are going to be a couple of qualifications that I want to like stress. So I think a couple meetings ago, school committee meetings ago, we talked about equity and the caseloads. And I said, at that time there was kind of a 60-40 split. And you can't really take 60 kids at an elementary level and 40 kids at the secondary level and think that the caseloads are equal. They're not, because of things like reading. I mean, we know that that shift from, learning how to read to reading to learn, if you don't have the foundations, then you don't make that transition to reading to learn. So yes, at an elementary level, there's a lot more in-depth services that go on that are like small group, that are individualized, that the students need because they've got to make progress quickly, or they're going to fall further behind and you're going to end up with that scenario like I talked about, a 10th grader with a 3rd grade reading level.
So are you saying that seeing a much, much higher level of C-grid ELA services at the elementary school, are you saying that's expected?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that is not one of the red flags we're seeing here.
No, that should be a trend that we're looking for,
Okay.
that we expect to see our elementary team. And as an example, when I worked as a school psychologist, I would test kids with a Wechsler IQ test. And the Wechsler IQ test, its first category of combined scores is verbal comprehension. So basically, how well you master your verbal abilities in answering questions or communicating with folks. And sometimes I would see kids with a below average range score in verbal comprehension. And they would be qualified for speech services. And then 3 years later, I would test them again. But with after 3 years of speech and language and full-time school, and their verbal comprehension scores would be up in the average area. So again, a lot of services at a younger age, but gets them up to speed by a certain time.
I just want to clarify what's counted in here. So we've talked on and off about kids that we tier 3 support, 2-tier support, that are not going to be on plans, that they're pulled out for a little bit of time to help them ramp back up. Those aren't counted in this number, correct?
No, this is
Yeah.
all.
This is
It's
just
straight out of the
straight out
IEP.
kids on plans.
So yes, when you look at the MTSS system, and you look at your tiered levels of supports, and I hate it. We all hate it when people call it this from a special ed perspective. But some people refer to MTSS or RTI and the 3 tiers as the pre-referral process. It really isn't. It's an all ed process. So it could include kids at, whether it's tier 1, 2, or 3, kids that are already on IEPs, but don't have an area where they're identified as a disability. For an example, a kid that probably doesn't have even a math disability, but is struggling with fractions, you might, in the MTSS system, even if they're on an IEP, they're not getting math support, so they could receive kind of like a tier 2 level support to help them get on track. But that's probably going to be limited to maybe several weeks, month and a half, couple of months, or whatever, until they actually kind of like get to where they need to be at.
From a staffing standpoint, though, those services are shared between the same staff, right? Some, no?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
So if I actually direct our attention to slide number 11, this is really kind of like the man-hour breakdown. And again, I'm qualifying because if you look at just the hours, it's kind of like, how do we do that? We're talking about sometimes groups of kids working together in groups of maybe 2 to 12, or receiving inclusion support services in a larger classroom with multiple kids in the classroom. So again, pre-K and 3 and grades 4 and 6 are broken down, and grades 7 through 12 all together. I'm going to point out the right-hand category, because if you add up the total hours for pre-K to 3 and grades 4 through 6, it's not that far off. It's like 30 hours difference between the 7 through 12. But if you consider that those two combined hours or categories are done in a 5-day cycle, whereas the secondary level is done in a 7-day cycle, you're actually talking about more than just 30 hours because of the condensed version of time between a 5-day and a 7-day cycle. So in IEPs, along with that service delivery grid, when we talk about frequency and duration, we identify what the school operates under. So HES operates under a 5-day cycle. Smith Academy operates under a 7-day cycle as far as IEP services and other things are concerned. So that's part of that calculation. So a lot of man hours really going into providing direct services in the classroom and pull-out services in things like in C-grid supports. If we look at our current staffing on slide 12, I'll qualify this a bit as well. We look at HES and we can say we've got 4 special ed teachers, but one of those teachers is a pre-K teacher and the other one is a STAR program teacher. The STAR program right now essentially has 2 students. We may have 4 within the next week or 2, but that's really where that teacher's focus is on right now. When we look at ESPs at HES, and I qualify this, the 7 IEPs that I reviewed, students had one-to-one services as little as 3 hours and all the way up to like a full day. So between 3 and 6+ hours. So when I say that was the range, there was only one student with 3 hours. Everybody else was 4.5 to over 6. So the other ESPs that are working are either working within those grade groups, like between like grades 1 and 3 and 4, 5, and 6. And we do have some other kids that have like one-to-one supports, but they're under that 3-hour category. So really, when we talk about total staff, I mean, yes, 15 ESPs at HES, but close to half of them are connected to kids anywhere between 3 to 6 hours a day as a one-to-one. And again, we have some other kids that receive less than 3 hours of support. So we're probably really looking at something that's closer to 8 full-time employees that are devoted time-wise to individual services for kids.
So am I misunderstanding this chart? At HES, we have 4 special ed teachers,
Right.
2 of whom are assigned to the STAR room.
No, one to STAR and one's a pre-K teacher.
So we have 2 special ed teachers who are kind of general across the whole school.
Yes,
And then one is the preschool teacher and one is in the STAR room, which STAR room has 2 students presently.
correct.
Which is still a more cost-effective alternative.
Yep.
Yeah, just to be clear about that.
Yeah.
So one of the things I found with the outliers, and this we usually cases that were like under 5 in my life. So these are all trends that I would say these are all negatives. Some of the negatives are that students receive a math support, but no math goal. Students receive a C-grid pull-out support, but do not have a B-grid support at all. So that's that resource room model that I was talking about. Some students have received C-grid services as a replacement to the general curriculum. And students receiving ELA support in core classes, except for ELA. So that's an unusual trend as well. Yes.
Do you feel that these were, like, for instance, like a student has a math support but no math goal? Does that feel like a simple oversight?
So there could be explanations for that, except I didn't find, in one of the examples, I didn't find this to be true at all. So as a school psychologist, I would identify like a reading disability. And usually in my recommendation, I would say something like, word problems in a math class might be an issue. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we provide inclusion support into the math class. We could address that through collaborative consultation between a special ed teacher and the general ed teacher running the math class. Just to simply say, make sure if you're giving word problems that the student actually can identify the process that's being explained in that equation. It could be that maybe we've already got somebody who's in a math class and that person would just basically do that as they were already working in there. And it'd be really unlikely that we'd be pulling the student out for support on just word problems if they're not doing word problems, much of the time in a math class. So I didn't find that to be really kind of like the trend or the pattern with some of these.
Okay.
Yeah. So moving forward, there's a couple of philosophies, and I tend to say these both quite a bit, especially the first one, because I've had in the past, fortunately not here, Nobody said this here, so I don't want anybody to think that this is something that people are saying to me in the hallways or in the conference room or the classrooms when I've gone in to visit. But I've had experienced 30-year veterans in teaching in general ed say, if we include those kids, they'll pull the good kids down. And the response is usually something like, they're all good kids. We're not identifying special ed as, it's not just mine. Those kids that are on IEPs belong to everybody. So when I look at students on IEPs, I see them as general education students first. And they just simply receive services through the special ed department. That doesn't mean they're a separate subset of the district in any way, because our goal, like I mentioned earlier, is that our goal is to make sure they make effective progress by keeping them connected to the general curriculum. If we're not doing that, again, we're not providing modifications or specialized instruction. We're not really providing special ed services. And then the second thing is that special education isn't a placement, it's a service. I mean, oftentimes in other districts that I've worked in, again, not hearing this here at all, but sometimes there is an out of sight, out of mind. If you have specialized programs, sometimes that is a go-to if folks don't want to actually address the needs of a child with a disability. And again, getting back to that mindset of sometimes people saying, well, they'll bring the good kids down. There's pros and cons of this as well. We know that sometimes kids with certain disabilities can be disruptive in a general education setting. We're also educating pre-adults. Our goal is to basically make these folks not just college and career ready, but they've got to be community and family ready as well. So if they don't have access to peers that have disabilities, they don't have exposure to that, when they become parents with a child with a disability, the mindset is going to be that, well, the public school will give them a separate program to flourish in, and that'll be good. It's not necessarily the case. Most research shows that when kids are included, they make better progress because they're with typical peers and they engage in experiential learning with those peers than if they're segregated off to the side somewhere else. So that's why when the state comes in and they do their site reviews and they look at any spaces that we use for pull-out services from related service providers or where our STAR program is, they want to make sure it's not tucked away in some corner that's not actually being seen or used by their typical peers, that they're more integrated into the system. And that's something I think we are doing here. We do integrate our services. You know, we're front and center in different entrances at HES and Smith Academy. We're definitely the Smith Academy where the special ed teachers are, is smack dab in the middle of hallways. And that's what we want.
So given the inclusion philosophy, can you talk a little bit about how you're partnering with general ed classroom teachers? Because it would seem that that partnership would need to be especially strong.
Yeah. So for the last probably 15 years, I've worked with a gentleman from North Carolina that I found through looking for research-based inclusion practices. And actually earlier this year, we did a PD on one of our half days where we spent, I believe, close to 3 hours with special ed and general ed teams. Not a huge group, but a group to get us started with this. So essentially identifying special ed teachers that go into classrooms where they work with the general ed teacher and the general ed teacher being there. So we focused on inclusion and co-teaching. And the nice part about that is that I don't think a lot of folks have had a lot of exposure to the different kinds of inclusion models. So the person that I use, he kind of bases his foundations in the philosophies of Marilyn Friend, who is kind of like the gold standard in the United States relevant to understanding the different inclusion and co-teaching models. So we focused quite a bit on the 6 different models, what they actually mean, how they can be flexible when used in a group. And essentially what should happen is that if I was new to the district and I walked into an inclusion classroom, ideally I should not be able to tell who the special ed teacher is and who the general ed teacher is, because there should be at its height in co-teaching or team teaching, There should be that ability for the two to actually plan, and sometimes that's a barrier for districts. It's finding the time to actually do planning between general ed and special ed together, whether it's done face-to-face or electronically. But I have actually seen this model play out in other districts because I've used him in essentially pretty much every district that I've worked in. He's not the only trainer, but the trainers that I have used besides him, there is kind of like a specific model for each one of them that does have a lot of overlap. We look at the students individually, identify what their learning styles are, what is the relationship between the teacher and co-teacher, and how do we actually help implement and support that through planning. And so most of the like PD that I've done in the past, whether it's him or somebody else, those are kind of like the primary principles that are focused on. But first, we start with the foundations of understanding what the different models are.
So if we gave ourselves a report card right now, how are we doing on that kind of level of communication and partnering?
So I'm going to say this is kind of the next slide.
Okay.
Because one of the things that I think that we need to do is really write our IEPs. And I've been stressing this as a mindset for folks. We should not be in an IEP meeting where we're either initial, an annual, or a reevaluation. When we start getting to the grid, we should start with B grid services. Now, I'm running really the majority of the meetings, like 98% of them. And when I get to that point in the meeting where we're talking about the service delivery grid after we've hammered out the goals, we've already talked about modifications. And then the service delivery grid, we talk about what are the B grid services first. So if somebody says, I've got a math disability, I want to hear what the B grid math support is first, way before I start talking about C grid services as well. So I'm kind of hoping that this becomes kind of like a routine. This becomes a practice. The more we practice it, the more people get used to it. And I'm also trying to introduce like a facilitated format to how we actually introduce this information. So it becomes more of a discussion from team members, not just going around a table and giving a report like is usually common in IEP meetings, but having more of a back and forth conversation. We use a strengths and challenges model to actually run our facilitated meetings. So I start with the strengths of the students and try to get into then the challenges. And sometimes I think that's helpful for folks because oftentimes I think that people think that I'm just going to come to a meeting and all I'm going to hear is the bad things about how my child is actually doing in school. But oftentimes what I see when looking at a strengths and challenges model is that usually the strengths outweigh the challenges of the student and help to kind of like frame that discussion relevant to what students are good at. And even the new IEP, it talks about, you know, it's actually kind of funny because before the new IEP, we usually didn't invite students until they were at least 14 years old to a meeting. And now the state wants us just to invite kids so that they understand that this is kind of like your voice, and whether you're young or not, you need to get used to this process going on a yearly basis or as long as you're on an IEP. But if somebody had asked me at like 6 or 7 years old, what do you want to be when you grow up? Because that's really kind of what we're asking. I would have come up with it, astronaut or cowboy. But that's not really even the point. It's the point is that they're at the table really kind of voicing and hopefully feeling or building up to feeling comfortable talking about what their interests are, but also what their barriers are to learning. If we understand from them what their barriers are, then it's not just a bunch of people talking about somebody. It's taking that input and developing a better IEP for them. And our goal is really put ourselves out of business. And that's the best thing what we can do for a student is to give them the strategies to engage the curriculum to the point where they don't need us anymore. So IEP is also, like I said earlier, and I've said this several times tonight, is we need to really kind of like identify what the modifications are so that our discussions are clearly defined as warranting an IEP. So slide 16, some of the other findings that I found just in internal review and kind of like getting to learn the processes here. And some of this I think may have existed at some time in the past. I understand that, staff changes relevant to like my position the administrative assistant position, staffing positions. Some of these things may have gotten lost before I came on board in July, but there was no central mechanism that was in place prior to me coming on board relevant to how we scheduled meetings or how we monitored progress in that. And so we've kind of developed a tool to help, a tool and processes to help us out with that. So really everybody's IEP who's up for an annual review or due for a reevaluation for the entire year, those meeting dates were always already set into place in September. So that's something that wasn't going on here. So I'm hoping that that actually improves on our compliance, but also the monitoring. Like if we run a meeting and we've got an IEP that's due within like 10 days after an annual review takes place, we've put into place, along with that other tracking, a way to say, okay, the day before day 10, we need to let the teacher know that they're due for that IEP to be in. There's definitely things that have interfered with that this year. I mean, HES has had essentially 3 people in one position so far. We had a permanent hire at the beginning of the year who left in October, a replacement who actually did a really nice job as a sub, but she was actually also out for close to 3 weeks. And then now we've got a new person who's just started after the holiday break. So, you know, those things actually do create problems and people lose confidence and you know, is my child actually going to get services? I know folks are asking questions about, you know, what's going on with services. Those are all legitimate questions. And anytime that we've had to address it, we've addressed it through the promise of compensatory services, whether it's being done this time when we get, you know, staff into place, or if we even have to do it over the summer to make sure that the student gets the services made up.
Roughly how many people have you brought that up with?
I'd probably say right now, a rough number, I would say probably around 7. And I do have to say, so that's what's been offered to folks that have brought it up. The expectation, though, with the new staff member is that we owe compensatory services. So there is kind of like this looking at the schedule, where can we fit that in? Whether a parent's asked for it or not, how are we actually going to provide it without people having to initiate the conversation themselves?
Mm-hmm.
So the other thing that was kind of lacking here, a couple different things that I came across. We don't really have a special ed procedural manual. There's a draft that I'm working on, kind of going over the final cut of it. I'm not talking about a 15 or 20 page document. I'm talking about a document that's going to be closer probably to 75 to 80 pages long. It will be kind of a soup to nuts kind of a procedural manual. It'll go through the initial processing for an initial evaluation, consents, how we run meetings, when documents are due after a meeting, depending on what type of meeting it is, how we actually will handle manifestations, rescheduling meetings, how services will be provided relevant to like B grid versus C grid supports. It'll cover really a wide range of things. And the manual will also be referencing things like IDEA and those CMR 603 28.0 to 0.10 pieces of regulations and legislation that I had mentioned much earlier. Also doing the same thing for the 504 process, because I'm not finding that we actually have a 504 manual as well. There's a draft version of that right now. It's probably, I believe, around 50, 55 pages so far. But again, I'm just kind of like going through final readings of it to make sure that the language makes sense for this district and that it is understandable, at least from not just my perspective. I'm having somebody else go through it as well.
I think we all would look forward to seeing that when you're
Sure.
ready.
Yeah. And also, there was a past practice, not big here, but it did lead to some problems. There are versions of accommodation plans. Accommodation plans are not IEP, they're not special ed, they're not 504. They're just an accommodation, or sometimes they're referred to as service plans, which can be kind of confusing because there is another document that's referred to as a service plan. Service plans, I'm going to be critical about this. I'm not crazy about them because the ones I've come across here, looking at like a reading disability and also related services. It's kind of like if we're identifying those things plus a math support, why aren't we just developing an IEP? So I'm not using accommodation plans as far as like a leg of the special ed department that's not really special ed. If I'm running a meeting, I'm determining eligibility. If I'm not determining eligibility for special ed, I'm referring to the 504 team, and then it would be up to them to rehash whether the student is actually eligible for 504 services. And initial evaluations, what I've kind of found with that is that sometimes there was delays in testing. Sometimes that was because certain things that should have been renewed as kind of like an automatic relevant to scoring software and programming was actually not immediately renewed when it was due. And sometimes there was kind of a mindset that we could put it off for a bit. And we are very much timeline and compliance focused. If we don't meet those timelines, then we're out of compliance. If a parent complains to Problem Resolution Services, which is PRS, like has happened this year, we will most likely be on the hook for a corrective action. And corrective action really usually falls on me because I've got to collect data to prove that we're actually in compliance and write a report to the state and submit that. And all of that does take time. So I'd much rather be in compliance than having to deal with a PRS complaint. So slide 17 really is just kind of a, I know I've mentioned some of these things already, but this is what we're doing. We're actually, when we've got vacancies, we've gone above just using like School Spring. We've actually used Indeed to post some positions. We've had some luck with that. We've also been reaching out to companies and other districts. Our PT service, we actually got somebody to cover that relevant to a private company that is acting as a vendor for us. So we've had some, I'm not going to say good luck, because some of these things have taken months to actually sort through, relevant to getting applicants or an applicant that would actually take a position. There's actually still positions that we're working on relevant to getting filled. We've looked at like our PD and focusing that on inclusion. When I talk about the TFM, our TFM, actually one of the few things that is actually part of the PD component for the TFM is actually inclusion. And also bus monitors actually having access to understanding the disabilities of the kids on their routes. That's pretty much the only thing in the TFM that is focused on those two things, inclusion and bus monitoring. And we've been looking at, again, our B-Grid services, having that as the main focus of our discussions when we're developing the service delivery grid. Looking at specialized instruction and making sure that we have an understanding amongst our staff that without those modifications, specialized instruction, we're not really talking about special ed services. We're using an analysis of data to make sure that that's also guiding our decisions relevant to our staffing needs and what our future staffing may need to look like. Looking at special education procedural manual as something that's needed to help staff have as a go-to document to know that, if we're looking at initials, this is what we're looking at for timelines. If we're looking at annuals, this is what we're looking at for timelines. And also the 504 manual, the internal review of teams. We actually do have one team that's going on every 2 weeks where we're talking about the referral and the evaluation process, who's doing what our timelines are, because that's a place where we really need to, like I just mentioned, there has been kind of like a mindset where we've kind of like put things off and we haven't met our timelines relevant to getting things done. There's also been some kind of like ham-fisted way that with staff leaving, just one example was that before the end of June, we had a student that was evaluated, but the staff member that did the evaluation filed the paperwork, but didn't tell anybody where the testing protocols were placed. It took us basically 2 months to find the information. And when we found it, there was no report attached to it. It was just the raw scores. So giving it to a school psychologist and saying, can you write a report off of this? And the concerns that probably anybody would have of actually doing a report off of somebody else's testing is really kind of like wondering if it was valid or not. And really trying to address how we would address that if it wasn't valid, which usually means a cross-battery assessment with a like tool, but not the same tool.
Would it not have been more efficient to just retest the student instead of looking for the test for 2 months?
We looked for it for 2 months, but remember, most of the time over the summer, school psychologists don't usually work the full year. They work mostly school year, maybe additional days, but that's not necessarily. So looking for it wasn't really going to waste any of our time relevant to testing because summer.
You couldn't have tested anyway.
Well, and they don't count as far as hours relevant to our compliance timelines.
Okay.
Yeah. And then really developing the central tracking tool to help us better gauge where we are relevant to our compliance. So on slide 18, the final considerations or recommendations, restructuring or looking at our staffing patterns, I really do kind of feel that HES probably is going to require a third special ed teacher to try to make that caseload more manageable. If we're looking at coverage, there were times this year where some of our caseloads at HES were close to 40. And that was partly because of like covering other grades and other positions. So if we could spread that out, what I see as a manageable caseload, most school districts would be between like 22 to 25. So when we've got 40, that's a huge caseload. And even anything up in the low 30s is sometimes not manageable because of the amount of work that is applied to providing students with B and C grid services. We still are looking at providing additional PD on inclusion and other practices that might actually help us out in the future. Special ed is a great thing to talk about, but it's better if we plan as a first step with special ed relevant to scheduling and grouping. So if we do grouping and scheduling first and then schedule and build the general ed schedule around it, sometimes it's very helpful in how we actually utilize our staff, and it helps us to utilize our staff better when it's done like that. And then we probably at some point need to build capacity in other areas, such as PT. We have a vendor right now, but it's more expensive to hire a vendor. BCBA services, again, outside of developmental delay, is SLD, and then autism was the second category. We have a part-time BCBA here right now, and we're kind of sharing services with an autism specialist and also our school psychologist, and we're making that work. It's probably not the ideal, though. And I know folks have been asking questions, but I'll just ask if there's any final questions that folks have.
I think there are likely questions. So I'm going to shift over so that I can see you. I know I have what I'm going to call a speed round, if I can do it that way, but I don't need to start. So,
Well, maybe some of your questions are our questions.
it might be. Does anybody have a burning question that they want to speak first?
Let's see, I'm going to go back.
No, go
Sorry,
ahead.
Were you speaking?
Nope.
So on your slide 15, what I'm hearing is that you really want to start with B grid and C grid is
Describe it as
secondary?
like a tiered support.
Yeah.
I'm not saying like MTSS or RTI, but least restrictive environment, talked about that briefly in one of my earlier slides. That's really kind of the goal of services. We should be asking, what is the least restrictive environment where we can impact the student's learning? That should always start with the general ed setting. Because again, we're not taking over the curriculum. We're not supplanting it with something different. Even when we pull a student out, we write our IEP goals. we can do the growth goals or we can do standards-based goals. If we write standards-based goals, we're keeping the student that much more connected to their general curriculum. So we should be starting with what services do we apply first in the B grid before we get to a conversation about C grid services.
But are you still anticipating that the C grid pullouts will be happening?
Oh, they will.
With a math disability, there will still be a group of kids who are in a class that is not the regular ed for their disability. That will still be happening, but you're just talking about the
So
other-
even if C grid services happen, the student should still be connected to the B grid. So when I talk about like grouping and scheduling, if I was developing the ideal schedule on a blank sheet, I would probably start with reading and math inclusion classes. I'd plug them into the schedule first. And then I'd pick my C grid service times at some other point in that blank schedule. And then the rest of the general ed schedule would be built around that. So that I would say that what should happen, ideally, is that a special ed teacher, ideally, would go into that B grid classroom. They would be co-teaching with the general ed teacher. And if the student needed C grid supports, that would be decided by the IEP team. But the special ed teacher would actually know where to target those C grid services versus having an ESP in the B grid and then the special ed teacher doing the C grid. So there's a couple things that we could work towards. Staffing patterns are going to be a huge part of that.
Okay. Thank you.
Others?
My biggest questions right now, I mean, I have others, but are about the goals. You had a lot of goals on like slide 17, like 9 different things that we're doing, and some of them, you know, we need to start working on, and then we have some final recommendations. So like at the end of the day, what would you consider like our biggest priority that we need to do to make sure our students are getting what they need?
Providing instructional staff that can actually meet their needs in a reasonable schedule. So I will go back to the fact that we've had 3 people in one position. When we don't have anybody in that position, that means 50% of your special ed teaching staff are out the door, and there's nobody to fall back to. So things are going to happen where services get missed, IEPs. Like I said in my email,
Right.
I've been writing IEPs more so than I've done over the last 17 years. I'm not complaining about that. I haven't been a teacher since the 90s. So I'm probably not the best person to be trying to write goals for kids that I don't work with.
In terms of these other goals, like these 9 different things, do you have like a timeline for example, the central tracking tool, or like a goal time frame for like the manuals or things like that?
Yeah, the manual, really both the manuals, I'm hoping within the next month to have the final proofing done. The tracking is already in place.
Okay.
And
That's totally done.
Well, I'm going to say it's evolved.
Okay.
If I'm finding something else that needs to be tracked, that becomes an issue of concern, it'll probably go into the document. But right now we've added probably, I want to say maybe 8 different points. And some of those points are literally, besides setting up the meeting dates in advance, it's kind of like if the meeting's rescheduled, we put into place, our procedure is going to be, if a meeting gets canceled for some reason, we reschedule within 5 to 10 school days or sooner if possible. So that's now become a standard practice of ours. We have kind of like notifications for when the IEP is definitely due. So again, that if we've got an annual review and we've given ourselves 10 days to write the IEP, which is what the state allows, up to 10 days, then on day 9, we're reaching out to the teacher and saying, this is due tomorrow because it's got to be in the parents' hands. We've also, with that, kind of like defining, I haven't seen this as much of a problem here, initials and reevaluations, that's a 45-day school timeline. People think that's 45 days to get the testing done and determine eligibility. It's not. It's 45 days to get the testing done, determine eligibility in an IEP meeting, write the IEP, and get it into the parents' hands by day 45. So, and this was something that did need some clarification, is people were scheduling meetings sometime around day 40 to day 45 and leaving really no time to get the IEP written in process. So we're actually saying 30 days for the testing, which is what the standard is. And then within 35, 37 days, we're running the IEP meeting.
I have a couple more, but you can go if you want.
No, go ahead.
Regarding the PD, is it possible to combine with other districts and do that, or to reach out to CES and have them help coordinate a multi-district PD for us?
We could. I've actually done that before with other districts. I've actually coordinated with, before it was SAS, there was some sort of mechanism at the state level. It wasn't called SAS. It was some sort of like PD support arm of DESE, where they would come out and actually say, hey, if you're a level 3 or 4 school, we'll provide technical or professional development assistance. And we did kind of like a regional PD on inclusion. And I've also done that on my own, relevant to, because the person I use is in North Carolina. Right now he does mostly virtual, but he used to do in person. So he'd come up and he would do kind of like bigger groups. And we would try to include other districts. So I've had people from, like when I worked in Narragansett, I had people from Agawam actually come up and participate in our PD. So it's very possible to do that.
Do you attend the student services directors meetings with the collaborative, or?
I do with the CES, and we are members with the Western group. I'm not currently a member of the ACE, which is, I hate to say, really more Eastern.
Yeah.
And I had been on the executive board of ACE, but I don't really find that to be as important out here as the Western group is.
Well, I'm the chair of the board at CES.
Oh, okay.
So I kind of push that, since we are members of,
Yeah.
of that organization.
Actually, Bill and I went to the last CES meeting like within the last month. And I think they've only had 2, and I did go to the first one as well. So
It would definitely be something to bring up with the other directors to see who we can engage with to do PD, and if the collaborative could help with any
Sure.
PD. I have 2 things left. The 6th grade moving up in the fall, that will help some with the workload. Some.
Yeah.
But that is a positive regarding this anyway.
It is a positive, but it'll probably be less than 10 students.
Mm. And what do you mean by building capacity in other areas?
So let's just take the PD vendor. So if we hired our own PT person, which we tried, doesn't mean we should stop. But we pay like a vendor who pays the person to come in and takes a management fee. So that is usually anywhere between like 60% more than what we might pay just somebody that we hire ourselves. So internally, that bill, it's more financially viable. It costs less. It's our employee, not somebody else's. So we do our evaluations. I don't evaluate unless I've got a problem with somebody. Then I'd go to the vendor and say, this is a problem that I'm having, and ask them to look for somebody new. But I don't really do the same type of evaluation that I would with staff that are internal. Other capacity building was really based off of like, we have a person who works as a BCBA, but they're here 2 days a week. Again, our second category disability volume was kids with an autism diagnosis. And we do have other kids that don't have an autism diagnosis, but do have social emotional behavioral issues. They still benefit from things like doing FBAs and developing behavior intervention plans. And we do have other avenues for pursuing those things, whether it's using one of our school psychologists or our school adjustment counselors to do those. But BCBAs actually are really kind of like specialists relevant to autism. And they do have a lot of good skills relevant to just doing behavior plans for kids that aren't necessarily autistic, but have similar problems relevant to behavior.
Thank you.
So I have sort of two lines of questions. The first is really about just sort of doing an assessment and understanding of how we're delivering on stuff that we didn't quite cover. And the second is really about more on family communication kind of stuff. So I think we've talked about, we recognize some things are not where they need to be, and much for stuff you walked into, not that you have done. So I want to kind of see if we can do these rapid fire, just because it'll put some stuff out there on the record and help us all have a shared understanding. You talked about doing a review when you started, but when was the last time there was a comprehensive review of services outlined in all our plans? Was that only in the summer, or has the team sat down since?
We sit down and actually, like, the meeting that happens every 2 weeks, that's really to address kind of like our evaluation timelines. So it's very specific to making sure that we're in compliance and reinforcing that testing needs to be done at a certain date so that we could run the meeting when they're scheduled.
And in that process, do you look at every plan every 2 weeks?
No, we only,
You
that
just look at
meeting
what's
is,
showing up on the radar at the moment.
that's for meetings that are coming up where we're doing evaluations.
Okay. When you have sat down and looked at all the plans, what percentage of our plans are we 100% compliant in right now, would you say?
You're not.
Any?
I'd say
What percentage
that,
are we fully compliant in?
yeah, I'd say that Smith Academy actually has a better, I don't want to say record, but definitely providing the services that are in the grids more successfully. You haven't had any staff really leaving Smith Academy. So, the attendance issues relevant to either people quitting or people being out sick have impacted HES much more significantly. But it's because of positions being vacated and
Okay.
trying to get things back on track.
And so what is our estimation for when that's remedied?
Like I said, as far as compensatory services, we'll try our best to get it done within this school year, but it may be part of, and some of the services we've written as compensatory into the service delivery grids. So those that we've written, most of them have been with timeframes within like the school year. But if it's an issue where we can't get the services done, then the offer would be that we just carry it over into ESY.
Okay. Are we currently staffed where we could meet 100% of the plans?
As long as nobody, yes, right now, we're very close to meeting everything that we need to, except for our reading interventionist, which is still a vacant position.
Okay. Reading interventionist
It's a very
at
part-time
Smith
position.
Academy?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay. So these are just things you know, I'm sure, off the top of your head on key milestones. And this is really the PSA version of tonight, because I think there is a lot that people don't know. And those that live it every day, it's just easy to understand. For parents who are walking in new to this, it's rough to find information. So help us understand some key timelines and what's allowed. So the time between identifying a student's, the call out that there might need to be testing and testing is 30 days.
Well,
Goal.
so
The
that-
time between requesting meetings. So I guess there's a whole bunch of little pieces to that timeline. And I'm really looking for you to spell out what's on
Sure.
all those milestones.
So consents actually start with when a consent is sent out to the parent. So if it's a reevaluation, we know when the reevaluation is due, and we need to send out the consent at least 45 days before the evaluation timeline ends. Now, part of the problem with that is that often consents sit on somebody's kitchen table, and it may be a couple weeks, or maybe 3 weeks, or maybe 3 months before.
Do we email them as well as mail them?
We do, and we also send out second notices if we don't get it back within like 30 days. That's true for pretty much all of our documentation, whether it's consents or IEPs that haven't been signed. So if an IEP hasn't been signed, we send out 30-day notices, and we do it essentially in like 3 cycles. And then the 4th cycle, we actually send a letter to the Bureau of Special Ed Appeals, basically saying that because we haven't received it back signed, we're considering it to be rejected. And then BSEA contacts us, they contact the parent. Is this something you want to pursue through BSEA? Are you rejecting the IEP, or did you just not get a chance to sign it and return it? So there's that with that. But let's go back to the 45-day timeline. The consent gets signed. The day it's returned to us signed is day 1 for that 45 days. We have 30 days to complete testing. Now, nobody asks, and nobody should ask, for the results of testing on day 31. It's just that's part of the time frame that's allotted to allow for testing. So that other 15 days is really however we break it down, but it's having the meeting scheduled. And we really should have the meeting scheduled as soon as we get the consent back. And if we're concerned at all that, and we're concerned that a consent might not be signed and returned to us so that we get the evaluation done within the 45 days, we're actually trying to send them out a little earlier than that so that we could have those things in place before the time frame for a reevaluation runs out. So 30 days for the testing, the meeting hopefully within 5 days of that by day 35, hopefully not much longer than that. And then if it happens on day 35, we determine eligibility and start to draft the IEP at that meeting. And then the staff have essentially 10 days to get that draft into its final form, give it to me for my review and signature, and then it's in the mail hopefully by day 45 or sooner to the parent.
Can I just clarify that you don't mean calendar days,
It's
you mean
school days.
School days.
School days, yes.
Right.
Yep.
I just want to make,
clarify that as well.
yeah.
Now, the annual process is a little different. There's no consent. We have an end date for the IEP. The goal is to have the meeting at least 10 days before the IEP ends. So when we actually have the annual review, there's usually a review of the team summary, and that gives us kind of like a 10-day window to write the IEP and again get it into the parents' hands. Not 10 days to write it, but 10 days to write it and process it and out to the parents. So I am actually asking my administrative assistant, don't just rely on like United States Postal Service. Send things out in email, because there's always a practice in most of the districts I've worked in. We'll put it in the backpack, and literally had a student come into school today with a letter in his backpack. And the letter was from us to go to the parents. And we weren't quite sure what it was. So we opened it up at the meeting. It's the invitation for the meeting. So, the parents never saw the invitation. They knew when the meeting was, but they just never saw the paperwork for it. So I hate to kind of like rely on backpacks. It's one method, but I'd rather backpack, USPS, email.
Do you believe that that is consistently working, that you're managing to get all of those out?
I think right now, because we've got this tracking log, that we're doing a lot better job than we were in September with getting the consents out and the meetings scheduled the way they need to be. And I'm not going to say there hasn't been some hiccups.
When did the tracking log start?
Tracking log, I believe I had it in place. Well, the first part of it was the scheduling of the meetings. That was in place by early September. And then recently, within the last month, we've added to it relevant to the implementation of the IEP actually getting developed and written and shared with the parents, the meeting reschedule components of it, contacting the staff members if we're up to day like 9 or close to day 45 and we haven't received the document back yet.
Can you talk about how changes to plans are shared with staff? What's the process for that?
So once the IEP meeting ends, if we do an amendment or we do a new IEP, like whether it's an evaluation or just an annual review, the document goes out to the parents. Now, sometimes we'll have some of our staff say, "Hey, have you received this yet?" And the process is that when we receive it, we send out an email to the general ed teachers and the special ed staff that are assigned to that student that we have the new IEP in hand. So unsigned IEPs, the active IEP acts as a stay put until we get that new signed IEP in hand. We get the new signed IEP in hand, and any changes that were made between the two documents, they start once we have that document back and signed, not before that. That was a problem here. IEPs were not signed and folks were applying services, which might sound like an okay thing, except you were still technically, legally working off of the old active IEP, and you were providing services that were not agreed upon. So it sounds good to say, well, we're getting stuff done early, but essentially you're also opening yourself up to a liability piece where if the parent didn't agree with it and wanted to reject the services and just didn't get around to it, we were essentially, if this was a pullout service, we were pulling a kid out of a classroom without permission, which is a civil rights issue. So not that it resulted in any of that, but that's the kind of path that it could have led to if somebody did not agree with us supplying services to a student.
And what about requests that before there is a plan, are those on the tracker? So if there's a request, if either a family member or a teacher suggests testing that there might be a need for services, when that request comes in, how is that tracked?
So we do have a tracking form for that. Consents for an evaluation, and this is part of the problem that we have with the PRS complaint. We should process that as an initial evaluation within 5 days. Now, the PRS complaint, the parent requested an evaluation back in March, requested it in writing through an email saying, I'm requesting an initial evaluation for special ed services. It got diverted into the BST process. Now, BST is like a 6-week process. So by end of
You
the
define BST so everyone's on the same page.
it's a student study team. It again, you could describe it as the pre-referral process. Not necessarily that way, because the outcome could be that a support or a strategy is put into place and the student makes progress and it doesn't go any further than that. But
That's the principal, the guidance counselor, the nurse.
So 6 weeks is not 5 days.
Correct.
So we were like definitely out of compliance, and the consent for the testing wasn't actually processed until I think it was like May 8th or 9th. And so we were already 6 weeks behind the 8 ball there. And then we had testing done. Testing was not completed before the end of the year. We had staff leave. The report got lost, and we found the report, but then they were kind of like what do we do with this? Is this valid testing? And additional testing was done at that point, but there wasn't a sense of urgency with some of the staff. So even though I had established what the drop dead date was going to be for getting this done, which was September 25th, the final day of testing took place on September 25th. So we couldn't run a meeting on that day because the testing wasn't completed. was scheduled for like August 9th. And actually the parent pushed that date aside in lieu of a little later date, I think on the 16th or 17th or something like that. And then we, ended up processing, but the PRS complaint was absolutely valid. They had asked for an initial evaluation. We didn't process that for a good solid 6 weeks. And then we didn't meet our timeline relevant to completing what should have been done by September 25th, something that had started on May 9th.
Do all staff now recognize what a request looks like so
Yes.
that will never?
So actually at HES, Melissa's been very good about giving me time at a couple different meetings where I've gone through those CMR 603s, especially, specifically, I think it's 28.04, relevant to kind of like processing and timelines, and really kind of like saying that there's certain things we don't do because we've had to address these a couple of different times. We can't just have somebody, whether it's a special ed teacher or a general ed teacher, just decide that we're going to change services in the IEP without a meeting. And even at a meeting, the team's got to be in agreement. And so I'm going to say that, like, during an IEP meeting, if I've got a split, kind of like some of the people at the table agree with this, some of them agree with this, it's the responsibility of the team chair, which is usually me, to actually make the decision as to what the district is going to propose. So we've had to kind of like stress that, not just in IEP meetings, but also in staff meetings where I've given them handouts relevant to compliance issues that we have been experiencing and how to correct those and what their roles are relevant to how we actually run an IEP meeting and how that IEP meeting is really the mechanism of how we change the IEP. Somebody can come to me and say, hey, I want this change in the IEP. It's kind of like, that's nice, but really we've got to go through the team process. If I make a decision outside of the team process, that's a violation. I can't do that. It's got to be part of the team. And that it's not just for me, it's for anybody else, whether it's Melissa or Connor or a teacher in a classroom, whether it be special ed or general ed. They can't just decide to change services because they think it's time to, or even if it's for benevolent reasons. They think it's going to benefit the student. That may be the case, but it's still going to be a team process.
There's an opportunity for learning on that front.
Mm-hmm.
How do we confirm that all of the outlined services in these 107 plans are scheduled, and how do we verify that they're being delivered?
So there are a couple mechanisms in the TFM process. Now, TFM stands for Tiered Focus Monitoring. It used to be called CPR, and it was aptly named that way because once you usually get your reports back from the state, you went into cardiac arrest. It's kind of like lightened up a bit since then, but the CPR process used to hit 59 points. That was all of the special ed qualifying factors that they would actually look at. Now they kind of like pick and choose maybe a dozen or so, and they break it up into groups A and B, and each group has like a different focus relevant to what is going to be looked at during that cycle. But one of the things is, I believe it's SE22, whereas when I get the IEP, I try to look it over, look at the service delivery grid, check out the goals to make sure that it makes sense. But there's also to be a component in that where in some districts that I've worked in, this has been part of the routine. I'm not the only one signing it. Sometimes it would be the principals. And the principal's signature would basically verify SE22, if it is SE22, which essentially states that the principals are looking at the IEP to make sure that service deliveries are actually being met and that related service providers are providing their services as well. So both special ed and, special ed teachers and related service providers as well. So there is that mechanism in place from the state.
Can I just ask one quick thing?
Please.
So for students who have scheduled needs, daily, weekly, whoever it is, they have OT on this day for this many minutes, they have reading intervention for, in my head, it feels like it should almost just be like a punch card. Like, yes, we did it on Monday, we did it on Tuesday, we did it on Wednesday, whatever day it's supposed to be. And then we can track whether we did or we did not. Is that?
Yes. So I am stressing that they keep a log because if somebody says, well, you owe me compensatory services, nobody's going to remember that off the top of their head. Now, that does become more complicated when you've got somebody who's left the position and you're trying to, but even that, you can figure out when somebody came on board. And still the request is that once you start services, you're keeping a log so you can refer back to it. And that's true for both special ed teachers and the related service providers. I will say that related service providers do that pretty much as a standard. I don't think special ed teachers have been doing that on a regular basis.
And if there's a miss, are you notified? Like, the head of student services, hey, we missed services 3 days this week for Joey. No.
So how are we tracking that?
If somebody actually comes to me and says, I'm missing services, but as far as somebody submitting logs to me for my review, that mechanism is not in place.
Respectfully, that feels insufficient.
Yes. So there are still a handful of flags for me. And I just want to start by saying, though, I'm deeply appreciative for the time and the expertise and the transparency in what you've shared tonight. And I think it's incredibly helpful. There's still some things that I can't quite see how we're managing. And it's not to say that we aren't, but I certainly don't have a clear picture of it. And it just gives me hesitation.
So here you do have, I know this is a small district. Special ed directors often wear a lot of different hats. You don't have a designated team leader. You've got me operating as special ed director and team leader. So yes, log reviews would be great. I don't want to work 14 hours a day actually doing that. And so there is a manageability component of it.
There also should be technology or something that's like there are some of these things that feel like there must be some solutions out there. For the life of me, I still worry that we don't have a good way to track all the things we obligate ourselves to do against what we're staffed to do and how that schedule gets built to be really efficient. And I don't know what the tools are, but I assume there must be some tools that help with that, because juggling the schedule alone to be efficient for teachers and for kids, I have concerns about how many times we pull one kid out of a class, both on the front that maybe they're supposed to be seen 20 times during a month and they're seen 4, and we don't know it because there's no system, because somebody's been out or whatever happens. But also that we're pulling kids out because to your point, we've overinvested in secret services. So that we're in secret stuff so often that it's hard for that kid to feel like they're a part of the class because they're gone however many times a day. So in fact, one of my questions on an early slide was sort of, for kids that are getting pulled out, what is actually happening? How many times are kids getting pulled out in a day or a week? Can you speak to that? What's common? And then what should be the standard?
Yeah. So one thing that kind of concerns me is that some of the grids that I've seen are identifying times that don't really line up with the schedule. So if I've got a 45-minute block or whatever the standard is for the block in each school, but I'm like actually putting in the grid 5 times a number that's more than each individual block, it's kind of like I'm pulling the child out of a full block plus time in another area. So that is always a concern of mine, because, and I can say this is another thing that I've come across. There's some grids that I could look at and the total minutes per week, or well, let's say per day, might have been something like 475. Well, there aren't 475 minutes in a school day. So what that means to me is that people are putting in services in the grids at, say, like 5 times 300, but then there's 5 or 6 other services that are listed as well. So they're not subtracting that from the 300. And sometimes that's okay, because if it's a one-to-one, the one-to-one's with that child for the entire time. But if the service is more of a specialized classroom and the student's actually also going out, they're not subtracting the numbers so that they line up with the actual minutes during the week or during that 5-day cycle. So that is a problem there as well. Most of that takes a bit of time to kind of like sort out. It's not new things. I've seen that quite a bit. I mean, people don't think to basically subtract the time that a student goes out to speech and language services from the time that they spend in classrooms, and they should be. So that is definitely an area that needs to be improved upon. People could do things like keep grids in ESPED. ESPED does have like Medicaid tracking. Now, not all kids are on Medicaid, but there are logs that could be put into ESPED relevant to how we actually track the information. But again, the system's designed for Medicaid billing, which is not all of the kids that are on IEPs. So it becomes kind of a, do we use it that way? And does it become more confusing if we eventually changed vendors? Because ESPED does have relationships with Medicaid vendors that we don't use. We wouldn't want necessarily erroneous information to be in a Medicaid system, but we could set up some sort of like electronic log that would be shared, whether it's through something like a Google Doc or something along that line. But there is that ability, is getting time to actually review it the way we need to, and addressing how we're actually going to provide, whether it's a recoup of services or letting parents know that, yeah, your child has missed, so many days of services. And that does happen all the time in most districts. Team meetings are a good example of that. You've got a team meeting going on, you've got a special ed teacher there who's probably scheduled to be elsewhere, but there's nobody to actually cover those services. We don't have buffers like some districts actually do, relevant to supplying somebody who can cover that class. So there are things that we can do to cover. It's not necessarily an ideal fit all the time, but it's better than doing nothing. The state looks more favorably when we try to do something to make it work, even if it's not exactly what we need.
My last general question to the presentation was, are students making progress?
I believe so.
We've talked a lot about really our side of this and nothing about the student side of this tonight. And so
I'd have to say, when I was talking about related services only, and I talked about the 17 kids that are essentially receiving services, several of those kids since that data collection that we've discontinued services because they've made progress. Now, when you look at an IEP, there are a couple different things in it. When you look at the goals, there's a current level of performance. And that current level of performance establishes on that day where that child is. So progress reports are essentially a new current level of performance. Every time a student receives a progress report, it is an update as to how that student is doing. And progress reports go out with the same schedule as report cards do in each building. So there is reporting. So if somebody's saying, yeah, my child's not actually making progress, or the progress report doesn't actually say that they're making progress, then what should be happening is the IEP team needs to reconvene to relook at that goal and reestablish what the focus should be of it.
I'm hearing from families who aren't even getting progress reports. So
Truthfully, I don't know how that's happening, except for if somebody's been absent or out sick or something like that. And then we're still trying to get the reports processed. But yeah, they're not being done necessarily in alignment with the report card period because there isn't the staff to do it at that time.
okay. Other questions? I'm sorry, Adam, I didn't want to cut you off.
No, it's like I cut you off. You deserve to cut me right back. Just weeding through my questions here to feel. Okay, we'll start with an easy one. CPAC.
Doesn't exist.
Correct. Have we made an attempt to make it exist again? Are we meeting what is required of us?
So I actually applied for a CPAC waiver. We have a membership with MassPAC. One of the mechanisms for actually compensating for not having an active CPAC is to have 3 presentations provided by the district. So we've set up to do a rights and responsibility training within the next few weeks with the Federation for Children with Special Needs. But I've also asked them to give me I've given them a couple of topics that I'd like to do, and that would give us a chance to offer 2 additional, or the 3 that we need to basically offer while we don't have a CPAC in place. The goal is at these meetings, hopefully to drum up some interest in having parents come forward and saying, I'd like to be a chair or a co-chair, and get some sort of like charter in place that really describes how the CPAC would operate, and try to get it moving again that way. There are some other options. I mean, we can always join with another district, but it's finding, like an avenue to do that with another district that would be willing to basically share their time with another.
I've actually been pursuing that through the collaborative. I've asked Todd to look into how member districts can manage not having a CPAC, and some of these small districts, if they could pull together to create a regional CPAC. He is checking with the legalities of all of that, and if the collaborative could not host it, but be a part of it, or if just help facilitate some of the smaller districts, hey, you are having a problem, and kind of get them together that way. So Todd's helping on that end of things.
There are examples of that, and one example that I can give you is, I don't know if it still operates like this, but probably within the last 10 years, Lunenburg had actually done regional CPAC meetings. They had championed it and invited other districts. I'm not sure how many took advantage of it, but I know they were offering that to districts in the north central part of the state.
The districts of the collaborative, there are 37 creating CPAC. So that's why I was hoping to pursue something, grabbing some of these, Charlemont and, Sunderland, or not that they're the ones, but smaller districts that are having issues.
Most of the other districts I've worked in, except for Waltham, the IEP populations were between, well, not the IEP, the total district populations were between 14 to 2,500. And we'd be lucky if we got like 3 or 4 people on a regular basis attending. So even with bigger sized districts, it's sometimes hard to get people to attend.
Sorry, I took it over.
That's okay. You discussed your tracking mechanism and how you're tracking IEPs. And we've kind of established there's not really tracking for when we've missed a service on any given day. How quickly, if services are missed on a given day, is the family informed of that immediately?
Oh, truthfully, I doubt it.
Okay.
Yeah. So the state, if we have somebody who's out or the position's vacant, if they're out for 2 weeks, we're given that time to notify families. So we've got essentially a 2-week window
Okay.
to reach out to them and say, hey, services have not been supplied in 2 weeks. We're letting you know that, and this is what we're doing. And usually those letters are, we're trying to hire somebody, we're looking at vendors, we're looking at other districts to see if we can borrow staff, things like that. But usually the letter's like maybe a paragraph or 2, just as a notification of what's going on.
How frequently have we sent that out this year, do you think?
Right.
I've sent out 3 versions for different things.
To what percentage? Like, you've sent it out to 3 families, you've sent out 3 versions to
No, 3
everyone.
3 different letters to whoever the service affected. So it wasn't kind of like a blanket letter to everybody in the district.
But like if we were missing a reading intervention for 2 weeks, anyone who was assigned to that reading interventionist would have gotten a letter.
Yeah.
Kind of, for example. So it's not like if we miss services for 2 days, we owe that student 2 days extra services. They don't need to get like 2 double sessions to make it up or something.
Well, it's a good question, because compensatory services doesn't necessarily have to be the services missed made up with the same number. That's what we try to do. And I've never handled it any differently than that. But the state actually talks about compensatory services. It's trying to make up, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the exact number to the exact number, though, again, that's what we try to do.
From a budgetary standpoint, and this may be a question for Connor, our compensatory services things we're budgeting for, if it was time lost in FY25, are we finding a way to get it out of the FY25 budget? Or are we really looking at compensatory services that we need to forecast into an FY26 budget?
The only reason we would forecast it into an FY26 budget would be if it went to the extended year, if it came after July 1st. And the other piece would be if there was anything outside of the school day that needed any kind of funding.
And I will say, so this is one of these, it's not necessarily an apple-to-apple comparison. If we're providing over ESY, it might be in small groups with the staff that's already working in ESY. We'd have to be mindful of numbers to make sure they don't go over, certain amounts. But if the student was getting like individual services, we might do small group over the summer. The parent would be aware of that as part of the discussion about compensatory services.
You discussed what you feel are additional or supplemental staffing requirements that we should have next year. Prior to all of this, have you communicated that to Dr. Driscoll? And the follow-up will be to Dr. Driscoll. Have we budgeted appropriately for that for next year?
Yeah, first,
we've actually talked about a couple of different possibilities there. So when I mentioned restructuring in my presentation, looking at some of the positions that we have, are we best utilizing them? So some of it may not actually be additional funds, but if we're deciding that by the end of the year or before the end of the year, if we really kind of like are looking and saying, well, we're talking about maybe repurposing this, but we decide that we really kind of like still need that position or that type of position, then we'd be looking at additional funds relevant to a budget request. But I think the goal is to try to repurpose in different areas that we can, whether it's utilizing grant funds or repurposing general funds that we have that are already designated in a particular area and trying to make those things work for the additional special ed staff.
Do we have the ability at the elementary school, if we had a teacher who was kind of co-trained, they were special educator certified and certified to be a 4 through 6 teacher or whatever. We have small grades at the elementary school. Could we have a situation where, one of the 4th grade teachers takes over teaching all of the math and all of history or social studies so that the other teacher could be freed up to also be a special educator?
Yeah, I'm not smiling because what I want to say is, and I realize small districts, you want split positions, and they're great when they work, but that's part of what got us into a problem at the beginning of the school year. We had somebody leave 2 weeks before school started. It was a split position. So we weren't just looking for a special ed teacher. We're also trying to deal with counseling services and no applicants that would fit both bills. So when you start looking at split positions, again, when they're filled with the right person, they work great. But as soon as that person leaves, then you're really looking at either supplying one or the other, or
I'm just thinking, like you said, we have two special educators at the elementary school to cover the whole school. Yep. Ideally we would have a third, but if we had a 2.5, we could, if it fell through, we could always fall back on the 2, which isn't great, but it kind of works.
You can post really as many positions as you want to under different criteria. Like you could post like a 0.5 or a 0.8 or a 0.6, and hope that somebody would apply for one of those positions that's going to fit the bill.
But realistically, does anybody? I mean, are we seeing applicants for part-time positions?
Well, truthfully, I mean, our PT, we ended up going to a vendor after posting the position for what, 5 months? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in the reading specialist position, again, very part-time, same type of thing. We've had that posted for several months now, and not really getting an applicant that'll fit.
But it wouldn't be a part-time position in my hypothetical land. It would be a teacher who is a 4th grade teacher. Special educators.
If you're listening to this meeting, please apply.
Special educators, they're usually certified to teach one of the broader categories. If they're at high school, they're an English teacher, and then they became a special educator. And then they end up usually focusing in that lane, but they technically have the ability to do both. And so in my head, I'm assuming an elementary special educator has the ability to do both.
Typically with certifications, you may have dual certification in different subject disciplines. It's less common to have dual certification within special education and like an English
Yeah,
or
you have
history.
one on staff right now.
Currently, but
Currently,
that
yeah.
person's about ready to move up to Smith Academy.
Yeah. So in historically also part-time positions have been harder to fill, significantly harder to fill.
So I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say we deeply appreciate the fact that those split positions create challenges for staffing, but do understand your job used to be split with the superintendent.
Sure.
So, I mean, we're very
is
familiar
true.
with those challenges, but they're also necessary for us
Right.
in the budget situation that we're going to talk about in a few minutes when we move on.
I could also point out that our current superintendent has a split position.
He does.
Yes.
He does,
Funny
in
you
fact.
mention it.
Yeah.
In the vein of part-time positions or fractional positions are hard to fill. We're saying we have a small role necessary at the high school, a few hours for reading intervention that we're not able to staff. Do we have full-time need for a PT here, or not really? I'm assuming, right?
No, it's less than a full day position.
Okay. I don't like this question, but I'm going to ask it. Would our students be better served in a larger system where they have, a system that can, we have greater need, so you will have more full-time staff available, so we're less reliant upon contract services, less likely that students would have missed services, or we wouldn't be able to meet students' needs.
I do have to say, and again, I'm not making a pitch to add an ETL. If you had a bigger district, I would be making that pitch, and I understand the need for like people to wear multiple hats in a smaller district. Some of the things that you talk about would be more monitored by having an ETL here along with a special ed director.
Educational team leader.
Thank you.
Yes.
It's what Michelle Otis used to, that was the title
Yeah.
Michelle Otis would have had.
So in the districts that I've worked in where I've had ETLs, those people will do things like help the staff actually write the IEP. I'm writing some IEPs because positions are vacant, people are out sick, things like that. But my schedule doesn't really provide me the opportunity to do that, to sit down with special education teachers and help them to write an IEP, monitor their schedules, work on their schedules individually with them. I'll give them some support relevant to their schedules. But really, that has been in a lot of the districts I've worked in, kind of like part of the role of the team leader, is to be that resource to the special ed teachers and make sure that things are compliant and on track. Again, that's not a pitch. That's just the way it works in other districts that are bigger, that have more of the resources. Most districts have like full-time PTs, full-time OT. You have a full-time OT here. You have good staff relevant to coverage, relevant to your speech and language services. Your special ed teaching services, like I said, I think we could use some extra support there because of the caseload sizes. But overall, I mean, you're kind of hitting the boxes most of the places where you need to. It's not ideal, but you're doing it. If I compare a district this size to a district that's 5 times bigger, you're still providing the services you need by ratio, just doing it in a little bit different format than other places that I've worked.
Is it still the case that districts in the area are having a really hard time filling services
Yeah.
and special education spots?
So a little over a year and a half ago, I was still in Athol. I was in Athol for 3 years. 2 years, I was trying to find an SLP, full-time position. Could not find. I had one applicant the entire time. Actually, and the person lived in Amherst and drove up to Athol and said, "I didn't realize it was so long to get here." So it just kind of like ended the interview process at that point. And I couldn't even contract with people. Everybody wants to do, especially related services that are provided by vendors. Everybody pretty much wants to do some sort of virtual service. Sometimes that works, but it also means that for those kids that need extra support, you have to designate probably a paraprofessional to be in that session with them. So when we could actually find a PT through a vendor that wanted to be here in person. Because I had a couple different people say, well, we'll do virtual, but that meant really putting a para with the student anytime we had a service in place. It was just going to, have our vendor costs, then pay a paraprofessional on top of that to be there.
Is there anything else the committee really, I'm just mindful that no one wants to be here at midnight. Well, most of us don't want to be here at midnight, but this has been really helpful too. So I'm just trying to balance those two things. Anything else? I think there's an opportunity for, I was glad to hear you're doing 3 presentations and one's already scheduled. I hope that you also have an opportunity to develop more materials that go to families to help them understand timelines, process, where their role is in the process, so that they're really clearly understanding when the clock is ticking, when it's not ticking, because I don't think any of us would ever want to hold up our kid getting what they need. And I think sometimes we aren't necessarily as informed about all of that as the expectation would be. So, and frankly, IEP forms are not by our design, but by what they are pretty horrible pieces of
Yeah,
communication.
they're a foreign language to a lot of families.
They're just horribly organized, and it's not our staff that's making them. They are a designated form that comes from outside. So,
Regarding those 2 additional presentations you hope to do, is there opportunity to maybe throw out a survey with several suggested topics and see what families might want to hear about?
Yeah, actually, the Federation does list, like trainings that are available by title.
But if you could narrow it down to a handful and send that out,
Yeah, we could do that.
that would probably help with attendance
Yeah.
as well, if it's something that people are indicating an interest in.
I would encourage you to talk to staff about some of that as well, because
Yeah.
I think they have some pretty good, because I think they're hearing from families. I know is hearing from families. Thank you. So we have administrative reports. I want to be mindful of the hour. Anything that you guys want to particularly talk about? Okay. So thank you for sharing those. I do believe we read them and that they're helpful. With that, I'd like to turn to the school finance subcommittee report.
Hi.
Hello.
So just briefly about the current fiscal year, there may be an upcoming vote at a meeting just to adjust our overall FY25 budget because we're coming in over budget for the year and we our official budget to match. Just things are the tech contracted services we under budgeted this year. That was our fault, and we're right-siding that for next year. But it was pretty significant. And then the field center is more costly than having our own staff would have been. So we need to just kind of give a right-sized overall budget for FY25 to match what we're actually spending.
But we do have school choice funding available to cover those costs.
Yes.
So it's not a request back to town for funding.
Correct. And in the vein of school choice funding, Dr. Driscoll mentioned that he's restricting any discretionary spending through the end of the year, try to preserve any remaining school choice funds so that we can roll anything that's available over to FY26. And on to budgeting for next year. The good news is that we're forecasting an increase in school choice funds for next year, a 16% increase, and then all of their funding sources we're forecasting to remain flat for the year. To maintain level services for next year, it would be an increase of $286,000, which is a 4% increase. $183,000 of that increase comes from student services. Parts of that are increased in transit costs, people that we hired in the middle of this year to replace previous staff were more costly staff. They were at higher steps than their predecessor. And we have increased out-of-district tuition needs for next year, at least possibly. And then we have a little over 100,000 in other known cost increases, including an additional 22,000 in the tech services contract, which is just kind of a rollover of why we're right-siding the FY25 budget for the year. So we're kind of fixing that budget line for next year, but it's significant. Budgeting goes up $8,200 next year. We're assuming about 2.5% increase for utilities. We are not going to put any funds in the LOA account, which will make things tighter. And of note that this number, the $286,000, does not include any newly negotiated costs with upcoming collective bargaining agreements. So that's prior to that contract or those contracts being worked out. Assuming we get a 2.5% increase from the town's funding, that's an extra $153,000. So we're looking at a pretty significant funding gap at the moment.
So it's ongoing work. So we're not coming in saying, here is our budget tonight, but it is, I would say, keeps me up at night, kind of concerned. Adam hasn't gone gray yet, so, you know.
Oh, it's
Mm-hmm.
I'm getting a haircut Wednesday. They'll be hidden.
So we also have some budget transfers tonight, just shifting stuff around. So that was part of that, your finance update information. So there's local budget transfers, and this is just considering some transfers I have seen in past years. These are really small adjustments, which I think speaks well of the budget that you made a year ago, because we're not shifting things around. And I just want to say I really appreciate the diligence in not shifting them to a slush fund and then out, because it actually allows us to track what we spend money on for future budgeting. So there's local budget transfers. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of those, totaling $3,445. There are some transfers within school choice. There's 4 of those for a total of $6,494. And I would
Make a motion to approve the
second you. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you very much.
I have one little question.
Yep.
The very first one, the money is shifting to athletic dues and fees. Is that the account where the student athletic fees is, or is
That's a
this something
revolving
different?
No,
account.
no, the athletic dues and fees is its own line, and it's to pay the MIAA.
Got it. Thank you.
That other would be a revolving account.
I thought so, but I just wasn't thinking what it could be. Okay.
May I add, because there's one transfer that didn't make it onto this that I was hoping to do tonight, and it relates to the PT vendor that we have. Currently, we have the cost of the part-time, part-day PT as a staff position, salary position, to move those funds to special ed contracted services, because we're going to be paying a contracted servicer to provide those funds.
Do you have the total amount? for that?
$16,000.
So just drain that first account, move everything over to the contractor
Yes,
services
yeah,
account.
just because we shouldn't be paying a contracted service from a salary line
Okay, so you want to move it from salaries to,
to contracted services, and
Contracted
that's in a local
services.
budget.
okay, so I'm going to make a motion to move 16,000 from the salary line into the sped contracted services. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, all in favor?
Just before we vote, it's 16 flat?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 Thank you.
Okay. Any questions on school finance?
Appreciate the hard work.
Yeah, keep it
We
up.
have more to do. So
Mhm.
that increase in student service costs, when we looked at that gap, is about $185,000 gap, and student services happens to equal that almost fully. And so we're going to take a look at some historical data to see what have we been getting back from circuit breaker. because at some point it's sort of like we may ask for like float us the loan because those services get paid for a year behind. But before we can do that, I think we have to be smarter about what we typically see coming back. Because that kind of increase would be, I think, well beyond what we could ask the town for. I don't think any of us imagine we're going to be able to ask for more than 2.5%. And truthfully, they would like us to ask not for that. So, okay, policy.
Okay. It is 9:52 p.m.
How
Uh,
you're at first readings.
Yep, these are all first readings. So we have 3 policies on the table. I will say that policy JK, which is student conduct, is the most pressing of the policies. JJIBA, which is participation in middle school athletes on JV and varsity teams, and JZ musical production. Those 2 first readings have to do with the move of the 6th grade to Smith Academy. We are not even going to recommend we're recommending reviewing them as we go, but then taking like a batch vote probably in like late spring or early summer prior to that move. So we wanted the committee to have them, but I don't feel strongly about really diving into those tonight, unless the committee wants to. JK, on the other hand, which is our student conduct policy, this is the foundational policy for our student conduct revisions that we're working on our code of conduct project. So I would love to hear from the committee if people are up for it. We extensively revised this policy with the purpose of outlining our positive values and philosophies as a district. And then, as I presented in a previous meeting, the more specifics in general, I guess, about discipline are going to be moved into policy JIC. So if the committee has feedback, we'd love to hear it on policy JK. From 2 of you.
So while Adam is rescanning, I would say I really like the positive approach to it. I think this is a huge improvement.
It is a first reading.
It's but it's just like the directional shift, I think, makes a lot of sense. It feels much more aligned with our educational philosophy, and that all boded really well. I got to the end, and I will say it. I was like, okay, where's the next section? It felt like there would be something more. I don't know what the more is. I just I got to the end, and I
we
was
were
just
like,
like,
we gotta end it on something.
okay, what's the tangible piece that comes next to this?
See policy JIC.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm content with that as an answer, but that was when I read it. My note.
A lot of this,
Oh, that's good feedback.
we benefit from meeting with the SEL team
Yeah.
and hearing their views. And I'm proud of this one. I really like the direction it went. I understand what you mean about, okay, what more is there? So I don't know if the title needs to change to the school's student conduct guidelines or philosophy or beliefs, or if it needs
It's
to be
really high level.
Yeah. That was the goal.
Kind
That's
of
why we gotta get this one
piece.
done.
Yeah. So
this is going to guide us
Mhm.
in the direction for the others.
I think I would wait and see what comes with it.
Mhm. In terms of adding more to this policy or the other related
It could
policies?
be like the policies that follow
Right.
it.
Right.
That this is sort of the umbrella of
Mhm.
this is the vibes of it.
Right.
And here's the stuff that gets more tangible.
Yes.
When I think about policies, it's like, oh, I know exactly what side is okay and what side is not okay. And this feels a little more
Right.
in the vibe zone.
Mhm. And I think that was actually kind of the goal
That's
in this case.
given that you have more coming. I get it.
Mhm. Right.
But
I think
looking at it standing alone, that was like,
It's setting the
Totally.
expectations. It's stating what the core values are.
and for the sake of anyone who, heaven help them, they're still with us. The core values, can you just read that second paragraph or maybe the second, the top, just so
go
people
ahead,
hear it?
Kathy. It's all you.
The school committee believes that all students deserve every opportunity to achieve academic success in a secure learning environment. Good citizenship in schools is based on respect and consideration for the rights of others. The core values of Hatfield Public Schools additionally include dignity, perseverance, engagement, and empathy. We always strive to promote a sense of belonging and community within our schools and local environment. The district holds high academic, social, and emotional expectations to embody these values. You want the next
Sure,
one?
might as well, like we're halfway there.
It's half the policy.
Students are expected to conduct themselves in a way that upholds the rights and privileges of others. When disciplinary action is necessary, it shall be administered with fairness and shall relate to individual needs and the individual circumstances. The district believes the purpose of disciplinary is to educate and equip students with the skills necessary cohesive community. Educators seek to help students understand the impact of their actions and take appropriate ownership. Ultimately, the goal of positive student conduct is to create an inclusive environment where all students can learn, contribute, and thrive.
Yeah, I need something at the end.
And then there will be other things forthcoming. Like there will be like a little
Yeah.
collection of policies that
Yes,
tie to
and that
this.
is how our policy manual is actually currently written. I think when we were doing our initial reviews, we were like, oh, wow, look at this great, huge policy about student conduct. It was JIC. And it's just like suspensions, expulsions. And we were like, we can't like lead with this. Like if we're trying to communicate to families and to our community, those things are important to outline clearly. However, yeah, there will be more. You have any feedback, Adam?
I'm happy with it. I don't necessarily think it needs more. I don't think it needs to. I mean, like the last line, I can see how maybe it leaves a little wanting or something, but like it doesn't need to sound like
we struggled with that last line.
it doesn't need to sound like a Jed Bartlett speech for reference.
It's just for me.
Yeah. Like
Go
it
scroll down at the cross references.
I think it was.
it seems. I'm perfectly content with it.
Yeah, to me, it's not the it needs one more line kind of thing. It's
No, it's like, where do we go from here?
what's the
Yeah.
it's sort of like when you write a strategic plan, you don't want it so that any strategy would fit.
Right.
Like I just want to make sure that it's
Mhm.
concrete
Mhm.
enough.
Mhm.
But I think you have pieces that are coming that are that.
Yes.
I'm not worried about it.
And that larger paragraph is kind of outlining how disciplinary measures.
Yes.
Still on a very high level.
Right. But it's setting the stage of the intent of discipline is not about the punishment. It's
Learning.
Yeah, and creating that.
yeah. Students gain skills,
Mhm.
recognizing their impact and owning up to things and moving forward.
So I anticipate in terms of student conduct, that project, we will bring this back for a vote at a future meeting, and the next policy in line is JIC.
Just for what it's worth, I did read the middle school stuff. I didn't see. I didn't have any comments.
Okay.
Nothing jumped at me.
Oh, on the
have any
sixth grade thing? Yeah,
Yeah.
that was
I-
exactly what I wanted it to say.
Okay, we
Yeah.
kind of wanted to
So-
like get them out there,
Yeah.
and then we'll just
So
bring them back
for what it's
later.
worth, for anybody following along, it's the new policy would insert that's when it talks about middle school athletes in JV and varsity teams, that sixth graders would not be playing varsity sports.
Is that already
Under-
part of the handbook or yet to be part of the handbook?
It's
Well,
not currently
not
because
there
sixth
yet.
grade's not at the school yet, but it will be.
It will
Yeah.
be. So I know that that's just been something that came up, so I just want to make sure I said it out loud. And there were some handbook updates, but I got to tell you, I wasn't sure what they were.
Yeah, so they're
Yeah.
So
highlighted
you
in
need to
blue.
talk
In-
us through
or
those.
Pink, maybe?
Can you show
Oh,
them to
purple.
us on the screens?
Well, I could, but the screens have
Screens
died.
all went out.
Oh,
Yes.
Well, that one's still
One.
on, but
We have one left.
You have one left over there?
that one's
Oh,
working.
great. So I'll pull it
I did
up.
scroll
So
forever to
these
find
so
it.
these updates are related to the tiered focus monitoring that John had spoken about earlier. So and we have a deadline of Wednesday to do these. That's why I wanted them on a vote for tonight. And these they all relate. They are highlighted in purple. You'll recall that the blue was the last
First one's on
at the last school committee meeting. We updated the handbook with some blue changes. Also for the tiered focus monitor update. And this the purple changes reflect some more of them.
Is the yellow still in there too? I
The yellow is the change from last year to this year. So yellow last year to this year, blue previous updates, and purple are the. And then we also had one blue change because they asked us to get time, and then that was their previous message. And then at the last meeting, they said, "Oh, actually, no, we were wrong. Put it back in." So we'd already voted to get rid of it per their feedback. So as we go through here, I'm just going to first one here, academic access. This is on page 12, if you're following along. This is a statement about students, regardless of any protected class that they may be under, having access to our academic programs. So that's on page 12. And if it's okay with the committee, unless there are questions, I'm
Nope,
not
just
going to
keep
read
going.
through all of them.
No.
Please.
Let's see as we keep going.
It's on 45.
Thank you. 45. I was trying to find the blue one that was up.
Oh,
that
there was
we
one policy
had to add back
name was
in.
added back. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, because we should revote on adding that back in. We'll go to page 45. Oh, here it is. It's on page 35 actually, and there's a little bit of purple there too. General procedures for implementation of anti-harassment policy. They asked us to take that out. They're asking us to put that back in.
Okay.
On page 45. Apologize for the seasickness here. Athletics and co-curricular activities is a similar statement to the academic ones. This is saying that regardless of any protected status, membership in any protected class, that students have access to our athletics and co-curricular activities. And
I didn't see any others.
that may be it.
That was it.
That may be it.
Is there a motion to adopt the changes as outlined on page 12, 35, and page 45?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
So tired.
Okay.
And with that,
Um,
you saw her email about the Title IX.
Yeah.
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 No,
All that we got to put.
Well, it's a
Well-
it's a conversation to have.
Yeah.
yeah.
It's not a mandate, I
got
don't
the-
think.
MASC.
So, Dr. Driscoll, I have a question for you.
Sure.
As it is 10:05.
Yeah.
Would you be terribly disappointed if we shifted your mid-year review?
I would not be disappointed
Would
at all.
you be okay with
In
that?
fact, I would be
Would the
quite happy with
committee
that.
be okay if
I
we
would be
tabled
okay
that
with
till
that.
till our next meeting?
Yes.
Okay.
And they have board update on by then too.
Seeing
So.
no other business, a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
And I think I've just learned there's Robert's rules apparently doesn't require a second or vote. Because we are adjourned. I was informed of this in a different committee meeting.
Well,
Adjournment doesn't require a second.
Who
so we
knew?
could just move to adjourn anytime
I'm going to be watching out for you
without
on that
anybody.
front.
I know. I'm going to be like
7:30. Becca's like, I'd like to make a motion to adjourn and just run.
9:01.
I was the chair.